Welcome back, folks, to the Get a Grip on Life podcast. Thank you for listening. If you're out there and you're doing whatever you're doing and listening to this podcast, we thank you. If you want to create some of your own digital media, you want to make a podcast, go to getagripstudios.com. That's getagripstudios.com. Welcome to the Get a Grip on Life podcast, Ed Roman.
Well, it's good to be here, Michael. Good to talk to a Torontonian.
Where are you out of?
I'm just north of Orangeville by about 25 minutes in a small municipality called Melanchthon.
That's a nice part of the country.
It is farm country, right? Reminds me a lot of Markham when I was a kid.
Markham's changed a lot, my friend.
It has. I lived a good portion of my life there. My father was a public servant for over 30 years. He was the mayor of the township for a long time, and I saw it change and go from being a robust farming community to being very different.
Before we start off on all the wonderful music accolades, and I love talking about music, but what is a paranormal enthusiast? I love that. What is that?
Well, what is the paranormal? It's out of the ordinary. It is extraordinary things that occur to people, circumstances, situations, whether it be spiritual, let's say, it has something to do with ghosts or the supernatural on that level, or strange aerial phenomenon. More lately, I've been really interested in the sort of changing and what's gone on in the planet over the last 200,000 years, reading from a lot of books from different catastrophists about the change that's been going on in the planet. All of that, I think, is out of the ordinary. Most people don't spend their time or even studying cryptopolitics or sociology. This is what I'm fascinated about the human condition, is the experiences that we have can be extraordinary. Some of us have the ability to summate it in some way, to be able to relate the story and talk about it, whether it be in an art form or not, or it now then becoming part of allegory of family life. And I've had my family experiences that have changed my life as a result of things happening in my family, and with friends that have passed on, that, on a psychological level, many people could say it's anthropomorphized as a result of traumatic experiences that have occurred. But ultimately, I look at these strange phenomenon as guideposts almost in my existence. And, and it's not like, the Shirley MacLaine version of Ed Roman or something like that, but I'm definitely fascinated by it. And there have been many people that have.
It's interesting. And I'm gonna say something that's a little bit sounds weird, but it's gonna come back to what you're talking about in a sense. Because I actually believe that if you're not engaged in your spiritual self, whether you're religious, whatever method you're using to engage your soul or your essence or that fire of God or whatever it is inside of you, I think you're missing more than half of life. And I'm gonna give you a little anecdote. Okay, so, and I believe this is true. I think it was Galileo that proved that the world is round. Okay. Now, when you say to somebody that the world is round, there's anecdotal evidence to prove that. Like, you see ships coming over the horizon, right? And they start from the top and then they rise over the horizon. When you're on a ship and you sail away, the earth kind of goes down. You look at clouds, it looks like the clouds are kind of crashing into the earth. You look at the moon, you can see the roundness of the earth and the moon is round, the sun is round. So believing that the world is round is not is anecdotally, you could see it and see evidence for it. But it's interesting. There's another guy named Copernicus, and he proved that the earth revolves around the sun. Now, that's always interesting. When I read a book about Copernicus, I was fascinated by this because there's no anecdotal evidence for that. All the anecdotal evidence is like the sun revolves around the earth, right? And 99% of the world, I would say, of the Western people are educated. They believe that the earth revolves around the sun. Yet they've never in their life ever encountered the mathematics, the geometry, the calculus, or any proof that that's true. They just believe it. And to me, there's something deeply spiritual about that belief. Although people think it's a scientific belief. But it's actually, I think people, when they're in that world, they say, the earth revolves around the sun. What are you, some kind of idiot? You don't know that? I'm like, well, prove it to me. Show me some anecdotal evidence. How the hell do you know? Right? And I think it's interesting because a lot of people, and music is very similar. I think the good music touches people on their spiritual or their archetypal level. And I think a lot of us, when you say you're a paranormal enthusiast, I guess what I'm saying, Ed, is so am I.
Oh, Nicholas Copernicus, he would be happy to hear you say that, I think. But I mean, and it's part of the collective knowledge that's similar to what we have in the area of music, in that level, that makes, you know, that person question, well, how do you know that the earth revolves around the sun? What's the collective knowledge that allows people to be able to say, well, over hundreds of years, we've determined this. Poor Copernicus was, you know, exiled and you know, out of the church, and everything that happened, and wasn't absolved until just a little while ago that the Vatican said, you know, Copernicus is absolved. With that said, there is a collective consciousness even in the art field that allows people to pronounce certain things when people would say, well, how do you know that to be true? I think it's through subtle observations and the idea of what we discuss and how we discuss it and how deep we choose to go into that information that shows a bigger part of the puzzle. Everything is pieced out in so many different ways and is continually happening and adding to that puzzle that it's sometimes hard to even define what it is because it's so rapidly changing. I'm often thought of Herbie Hancock quite often when I think of this kind of moment where he wrote on the back of one of Jocko's first albums, Pistorius's record, that the definition of an artist is one who has the ability to fuse their life with the rhythm of the times.
Wow.
And what is that?
Wow.
Yeah. And I, as a teacher, I used to use that statement even to my students because, you know, gravitating between the passage of loving, falling in love with music, trying to understand it, being influenced by so many different people, and then allowing those influences to bypass you, to allow yourself to be yourself. And what do you have to say? In that same essence, whatever you want to call it, the Akashic record of the moment, the collective consciousness of certain things, your own personal experiences intertwined into it as a result of those observations, it becomes a part of that mathematical equation that says, yeah, that's why the earth revolves around the sun. And there's a beautiful, delicate balance between understanding what that is and an incredible amount of time and tenure that takes for us to be able to say that without, you know, you and I getting out in a spaceship somewhere and actually checking it out.
For sure.
And understanding how that works. But that is belief. I do believe it.
Let me ask you a question.
Yeah,
how much does that collective belief contribute to what is true and not true?
That's a really good question because I think it ultimately depends on what we feed it. It's the weird Cree analogy of the dark wolf, light wolf. It's the dark side of the force, the light side of the force, however you want to feed into it. It's like good deeds, good thoughts, and good actions should be feeding into the collective consciousness as a sense of positivity and vibrancy, whereas the negative side of things, which is what we can feed off of ourselves as a result of our own experiences. This is where the paranormal world would say a PK manifestation and in a location of a building or something was actually created by the negative thoughts and actions of an individual and now exists in the other side of a dimensional ether as some form of energy. And I think it's the same thing. We ourselves can pump either the good or the bad into what that is. It becomes stable, it becomes unstable. It's the yin and the yang. It's continually going through this ebb and flow as a result of the human condition.
I agree with you. And, you know, it's interesting. I've often said to people, like, you know, you're listening to somebody talk about being Canadian or being German or being American or whatever. And I say, well, what is Canadian? What does it mean to be Canadian? Right? And they'll say, well, it's a place on the map. I'm like, well, if you go to the 49th parallel, there's no line there. You know, the water flows across that line. The air blows across that line. The forests grow across that line. Enormous seams of mountains cut through that line. That line is a is a figment of our collective imagination, right? But if you think about it, to me, all Canada is, and this is going to feed into your point about that PK with the bad decisions or the negative thoughts or actions. If you take what Canada is, all Canada is an agglomeration of human decisions. How many of which are good and how many of which are bad create the environment we live in, right? And if you say, entropy or matter cannot be created and destroyed, I think the spiritual energy of those decisions cannot be created or destroyed, right? So I think what happens is, and there's a reckoning, and that reckoning can come within a generation, it can come within a week, or sometimes it comes within multiple generations down the line. The Bible talks about this for sure, that the sins of the father will be visited on the fourth and fifth and sixth generations. And if you think about how Canadians and Americans treated First Nations people, we are certainly paying the price of that, the weight of that behavior. If you think about how Americans, the slave trade, the brutalness, the brutality of those decisions and the negativity surrounding them are still alive and burning through people's hearts, even in 2019.
You're absolutely right. And those collective decisions that become hardwired into our process of decision making, which is whether it be the fiscal changes in the year that we all sort of rush to participate in, or what's really interesting about your statement is that indigenous person factor. It's the cultural divide and the advancement of different forms of technology through dogmatic practices. So here you have the eastern part of Europe, who has developed completely differently, all of a sudden traversing across great distances of ocean, integrating with cultures, not understanding them. As a consequence, the byproduct is destruction, and almost foresaw by many Aboriginal cultures as a result of whatever spiritual practices they have. Some may even argue that the Mayans themselves understood what was going to happen with the Spanish long before it happened, and it happened. I think that's where those big, huge cultural misunderstandings, even between the divide and the border that you're talking about between Canada and the United States, exists, where it's like, well, what makes us that different? It's really the languages and things that we've used in the past inside of generational change that eventually become obliterated as a result of time. And then the things that we keep manifesting and say, well, these are the things that make us culturally different. A lot of the times, currency is a big thing that separates us, which creates a different kind of hierarchy and a pious-like behavior in cultures, which usually means takeover of weaker cultures, because again, might is right. And then at the same time, you've got dogmatic practices, whether it be religious, that fight each other, which really all consequently are pointing to the same kind of idea of salvation, but perturbed so often by our interpretations of what those things, whether it be scriptural or on a law level, from a point of practices of law, relate to, as far as how we then behave or what are the inevitable consequences of those actions. So there's so many things that I've always found that are the dividery in our sociology, and very few things that are always pointing out our similarities. When I was a kid growing up in the 70s, it was like, oh, what is Canada? United States is the melting pot. Well, what is Canada? We were taught that it was this cultural mosaic. And I really took that to heart as a kid, because even my dad, when they first came here and immigrated from Slovakia, they were out on Scugog Island, and the first people that actually accepted them were the Scugog Indians. So I have an attachment to a lot of Aboriginal people, even in Canada, as a result of that. So I guess my perspective of what that represents may be different than somebody who even culturally through generations has been taught, no, they're different than us. They're not in our club, kind of a thing. And I see even those kinds of prejudices that exist today, even in small burgeoning communities where I live, where there's already a divide between what the old world mentality was for like 120 years in a farming community, and a whole bunch of new people that are moving up here, and a certain amount of what you would call gentrification happening in the area. And there's this conflict as a result of it. And really, it's non-communication that keeps permitting that, and old world ideas that make that feed into that collective of negativity. And
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I 100% agree with that. Can I throw an idea
Yeah.
at you? Because I think there's an interesting kind of angle to this that I'd like to throw at you. See what you think. And then I promise we're going to talk about music. I promise.
No.
There'll be a segue
This
here.
is the third musician I've invited on. It's never about music.
So I remember I read a bunch of things about the Mongols. Remember the Mongol Empire in okay, the largest contiguous land empire of all time. Okay, so I read about them. What they would do is they would move into an area out from Mongolia. They would study the people there. They would send in spies, and they would find out their religion. Okay, and they would study their religion, and if it had an apocalypse, they would then, the king or the Shah of Iran or whatever would get a letter, Shah of Baghdad or whatever would get a letter, and it would say, "We are the vengeance of Allah, come to punish you for your crimes. And Allah has told us that if you don't repent from your crimes and give all your cities to us and become a vassal state of ours, we will smite you from the earth." Right? My question to you is, I actually believe that they are the vengeance of Allah, in a sense. I actually think that there is this idea that these human cultures become sort of trapped in a certain place. There's too many people, or there's not enough food, or there's just like this cultural meme that's flowing through them that they're better than others, or that they have the right to kill others, or they have the right to take away stuff from others, and they explode out into the world in some kind of violence. And that violence can be, murdering bands of horsemen with bows and arrows. It can be ships crossing seas, or it can be in an economic form with purchasing of properties and taking over land and slowly and incrementally using existing laws to displace people and take what's the resources that are there. But I think largely that's the history of humanity. And it has never changed. It's like it just has a different form. So when people say, oh, it's a cultural mosaic, well, in a sense, you could interpret it, if you look at history as these exploding populations that get an innovation or have more money or for some reason want to travel across the seas and set up new bases of operation in wherever, and they use whatever the tools they have in place, whether that's arms and killing or whether that's money and law, the legal practices of whatever, and they displace people, and old cultures die and new ones emerge. And I think it's just the history of the human species.
That's a wonderful point, and it's a really archaeologically significant point, because there are many things attached to your statement that are proof in the pudding when you look at whether they be paintings or lithographs or mosaics in Roman and Greek times or whatever. They're depicting battles, Egyptian chariots in battle, whatever it might be. There is this continual sort of sense of takeover, birth, growth factor, bell curve thing going on. And what's really been interesting about, and I totally agree with you, and that's a wonderful point. One of the things about some of the catastrophists that I've been looking at, who have been looking at what they call deep history, which is a lot of stuff as what we know as non-written. If you go cuneiform, if you're thinking about Sumerian text and what that represents as far as some of the earliest written kinds of languages. Prior to that, it probably was sort of effigy related or lithograph or emoticon or shape or image related, like a cartouche or something Egyptian. But there seems to be, in that time frame of what we know as written history and what we know as deep history, where imagery itself that exists, which is extremely fragmented and pockmarked through the archaeological chart, suggests that there was large periods of time where there didn't seem to be a lot of that aggressive-like behavior in terms of human sociology. There was more of the divine worship in certain things that had to do with life and existence. And what seems to be interestingly tied into that moment is around the time of the Younger Dryas event, which was the huge cataclysmic event that they feel was responsible for the melting of the ice caps, was this inherent sense of danger, fear, loss of life, incredible amount of loss of megafauna, flora, anything that you can think of, is still impacting us today in this negative emotion kind of way that actually makes us more aggressive as humans than we were before. It becomes tied into this fight or flight method and the extreme amount to survive, the need to survive inside of the condition. As a result, we've been going through exactly what you just said for so many thousands of years, this sort of bump, ebb and flow factor of what it represents for conquest, holding on to something that may disappear, the sense of materialism, triumph of the ego, all of those kinds of things that feed into that. So your statement before is so true, and I'm glad you questioned me on what I was saying before too, because I think it sort of ties into a lot more of what we don't know about us as human beings. Because as we sit here today for almost 200,000 years, our brain capacity, the size of who we are as people, all of that really hasn't changed. So there's got to have been a lot more going on in deep prehistory than we actually know or even understand about ourselves. So
I know what a paranormal enthusiast is now. I know what it is. It's somebody who's incorporated it's someone who has incorporated a very meaningful and deep sense of humility and awe at his existence. That's what it is. Someone says, I don't have all the answers.
I really, I appreciate that statement because I am humbled by a lot.
Yeah, me too.
Excuse me. You pushed my button, buddy. I mean, it's a big part of why I do what I do is because of life passion. Music to me has a lot of that going on in it. My mom and dad always said to me, I don't care whether you're a shoe salesman or a mechanic or a brain surgeon or an astronaut, so long as you're passionate about what you're doing. That's the key to life. It's the key to perpetuate creativity, so many different things. So it's been a long time since I've had that kind of whirlwind of conversation with somebody, and then to summate something like that and say that I feel humbled by your statement, sir.
You know what's funny is that I had an experience. I worked with a spiritual coach, a messenger from God, I call him. His name is Luke Sellers. And he basically showed me that I've spent my entire life living in my ego. And and I got out of my ego. Now I'm not perfect. I go back into that ego. You know what's interesting? I watched a video the other day on YouTube, and it's a real video, and you got to be careful when you Google like Adolf Hitler videos or something like that. But I'm fascinated by the Second World War and post-war Germany from the First World War. And there's this video of when France signs the armistice with Germany in 1940. And there's a video of this, of Hitler signing this with them. And what happened was that in 1918, they signed the World War I amnesty in this train car, right? And the generals, I don't know, I can't remember their names. But anyway, they signed it in that train car. And then Hitler, after France capitulated, they found the train car, the same train car. And they pulled this train car out, the same one. And there's a video of Hitler walking into this train car. He signs the capitulation of France. And he's in the middle of some field. There's no crowd around. It's just him and a few Nazi generals and some French politicians and generals. And he walks out of this train car and you see him. And I'm telling you, man, the ego, you can just see it on him. It's enormous, right? And you can only imagine how the German people would have seen that as a redemption from God or something, because they had been through so much pain, But you could see on him, like if you watch it, he looks like a, when you see Lord of the Rings or whatever, you see Sauron walking out in his armor and he looks impenetrable and he's just oozing egotistical, maniacal control and egoness, and it's just all over him. And you can see it. Like you think about how incredibly unbelievable what he accomplished was, in a sense, if you look at it from a a diabolical sense. He pulled out the train cards and we're re-signing a new deal now. And he walks out and the German people have now righted all the wrongs of the past and this kind of stuff. But on him, you could literally, in that video, you can see the oozing of the hubris and the pride that comes before destruction.
You're totally right. And I know that video too. And God, that whole rubbing it in your face factor, that's right there. It summates it, like you said. It's underlined and pointed and dotted. And not only that.
And it's seductive as hell, man.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm fascinated by the Second World War. People know me. If I could buy a U-boat and put it in my backyard and throw like string beans on it, I would, and have parties on it and stuff, just because I'm fascinated by German engineering at that time frame. And we could get into a whole other thing about Operation Paperclip and the Red Cross and the Vatican and many other people, right? But regardless, that moment was not only tied into the ideology of who they were and what they deserved after the Treaty of Versailles.
Vengeance.
But the ideology of this sort of genetic neo-Christian kind of concept and the kindergarten, which was, the development of early minds and in the indoctrination process, is fascinating. Not because it's like, wow, cool, they're training kids to be killers, but there are certain things even today in mass commercialism that work identically, and people don't even realize that they're being inundated with that kind of subtle stuff, especially from the age, like, I love kids, man. And I've taught kids for a long time, and I'm always so interested in what they're thinking about, and they're like sponges. And man, I just don't think kids are getting a chance a lot of times today to be kids the way we were without the infiltration of technology and everything. Even colors. Okay, beautiful. You're so lucky. Colors themselves as frequencies also represent change and choice and the decision-making process. We are continually confronted by colors from the time that we are young in terms of frequencies. Johnny gets the red train or the wagon that's red. Sarah gets the light blue dress or the doll with the pink outfit. Those hyper-aware colors that are already sensitizing the young mind into what those things are. Flash forward to teenage years where you got those hyper colors that exists in like foods, whether it be a lot of fast foods, reds, yellows, blues, and those kinds of things. They're always promoting that same thing, hyper accelerate into the 20s and something. Now you've got alcohols, tobaccos, everything that are related to those colors and sensitivities, the very things that tell us to stop, when you're on a side road, is also this very same thing at Valentine's Day that, the red, hi honey, I love you, here's the chocolates. These frequencies are continually being bombarded at us, and we don't even realize it. It almost has that same like Goebbelian mentality of brainwashing to make those. Just how many decisions that we make every day are really based on something come out of nothing, that are they're always that the consequences of our choices are so colored that my biggest consequential change decisions happen pretty much in my garden, where it's like, okay, there's peppers and I need to do some weeding. Now I know there's going to be weeds. That's already predestined thing. I know there's peppers there, but there's no sign telling me how to do it. I just have to get down on my knees, start doing what I'm doing, get the work done, and go through the process. That's the detachment factor. And it's my decision whether or not I do it or not. I could say, forget about it, let it get all weedy, and I'm not going to get as many peppers, or I'm going to, whatever it might be. Those are all those basic decision-making processes. They're still heralding in those ideas that yearly those processes have to go through something, but it's not like, hey, I just thought I'm going to have a hamburger right now because I saw a commercial and the kids are running in the backyard with the dog and whatever it might be. That's all part of that.
Let me give you an example of that. So I'm in the lighting. I think you're going to like this one. I'm in the lighting business, and I do a lighting podcast that's very popular. Okay, so commercial lighting, industrial lighting, right? I've interviewed a ton of scientists, and they're actually starting to figure out how they can use artificial light or electric light to improve people's daily engagement in the world. So they can actually, like they're starting to understand how this works. So what it's involving the training of your circadian rhythm, for example. It involves like exposure to certain color temperatures at certain times and all this kind of stuff. But I flipped it around on one of the scientists and I said, you know what? I said, you guys should probably stop doing everything you're doing and go find the guy who designs the Bellagio Casino in Las Vegas, or the guy that designs the MGM Grand, because casinos have been designing circadian rhythm disruptors for 50 years. They've known how this works for 50 years, maybe longer. They know that if you shine white light in a person's eyes at a certain level, they'll give you their paycheck. Like, they know this. It's like you go into a casino, all it is vertical light shining in your eyes with colors and blah, 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 sounds. And I don't know about the sound, but I know that the light is designed to disrupt your circadian rhythm and make you think it's daytime when it's nighttime. Make you stay awake. 100%.
And pump in the oxygen.
Yeah, there's all sorts of other things they do, but they also shine the light vertically directly into your eyes. And they do this because it makes you awake. It makes you stay awake. It starts you off in your day. It also puts you into like a kind of a trance at the same time, like a hypnotic trance, right? And they know that they can, I'm like, why are you wasting your time studying this? Just go study casinos and do the opposite. And you'll get to where you're going faster, right? Like then, like do the opposite of what casinos are doing. Bring in natural light. Right? Bring in lots of natural light. Put in skylights. Another thing that was interesting about lighting and casinos in this and whatever is they did this study where they studied the difference between kids that had classrooms with a lot of windows and kids that had classrooms with no windows. And they discovered that the kids with windows had 17% higher grades. Like, it's not a question. Windows in classrooms are good, but they don't know the reason why. Is it because they can see outside? Is it because of the light? But there was a really interesting little thing. This one guy studied like 160 studies. And one of them noted that classrooms that had these solo tubes, so skylights, but that sunlight is brought down through a reflective tube, okay, and into the classroom. Okay, so they can't actually see outside, and they can't know that it's the sun, but it's actually putting in natural daylight into the room. Those kids performed better than the kids that didn't have that as well. And so what's interesting is like this idea of light and being outside and this idea of light being clean. Is there clean light or dirty light is very interesting. The second thing I wanted to talk to you about on your last point about the garden was that, and in your music, I think this is a good segue to get into your music as well, is that what I think you're doing when you go into that garden and you're in that place and you're doing that, I think you're going into a flow state, similar to when you're maybe playing music very well or whatever. You're just weeding and you don't even have to think about which one to pick or which one not to pick. You're just doing it. And then your mind is like flowing and flowing and flowing, right? And I think there's something to musical training that helps people get to that flow state. And that's why music is maybe the highest art form, because it is a flow state. Like when you see a band on stage, and they're rocking, man, they just sound so good and they're improvising as they play. Like there's nothing better than when the guitarist and the other guitarists come together and they're just going off and they're just playing. They're not even playing the song anymore. You know what I'm talking? You would know better than me. And they're just vibing off each other. And it's wonderful. You see it in orchestras where all of a sudden the trumpeter will stand up and just start playing and the conductor rolls with him and lets him go and then it shuts him down right at the perfect point or whatever. And he sits back down and then whatever. There's something about music that brings people to a flow state where all the beauty of the universe is. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy.
No, I think you're a beautiful human for everything you just said, because
thank you.
There's so many things I want to say. I mean, you're talking about light therapy. Many, many years ago, back in the 50s or maybe even the late 40s, Royal Rife came up with the Rife light design, which was a frequency-related tube bulb. People are using them today in all kinds of different reasons. I have a friend that used to have terrible psoriasis, and he went for Rife treatments. And
how do I spell that?
it's called RIFF. The gentleman's name was Royal, like you hear it, like Royal King or whatever, yeah. Rife. And he developed this light frequency thing. He was basically like heralded as a crazy guy. It would never fly. You know, new types of Western practices in terms of medicine were really changing at that time. And like a lot of innovative people, kind of got shut down. And if you look into his story, it's kind of a sad thing. It's almost Tesla-like in terms of what he went through in the process of that. But today, those machines are being used. Again, there's so much I want to say. Studies of the kids that are in classrooms with more light. I mean, I know from growing things that the planet, as it goes through its equinoctial change, we lose light. It changes in its own spectrum from a blue light in the summer to a far more vibrant orangey, yellowy light that exists in the fall and springtime. Those are the subtle things that remove, chlorophylls and things and the sugars that are in leaves. It induces blossoming as a result of a loss of light. You get extension in plant growth as a result of all of those spectral changes. If you get a terrarium, and you've got an iguana, and you want to, have plants in it, the bulbs that you buy are spectrally attuned, not only for the animal, but the luminance themselves that the lights are giving off are essential for that sort of plant growth to sustain themselves. Because without it, a normal incandescent bulb is light. It's actually vibrating frequencies at 60 hertz a second in terms of old incandescent bulbs. It's so fast that it's stable. It used to be 30, it used to flicker, but it's the same thing. Those luminance aren't in a normal incandescent bulb, but they are in the solar spectrums of things, and people have figured out a way to measure those solar spectrums through spectral graphs to determine we could build a bulb like this. And that's exactly what Royal had done. And it doesn't surprise me. You talk about passing information through light. I met a gentleman who's the editor of Tesla magazine, Bob Connolly. He does a thing every year at the Science Center. He showed me a lot of really interesting things about high spectral frequency bulbs that are now what you call LED bulbs. I know and you may know as a technician of lighting, some of my gear in my studio works on fiber optics. We're actually passing binary code in light down a fiber optic tube in order to transfer information from a computer to a hard drive to whatever it might be. All of that means that information can travel through light. It's completely possible. So the idea that even LED systems, which work on a higher spectral frequency, he had these crazy little units in here, and he was measuring my bulbs, and we did some tests up here, which were really cool. And you could hear actually RF frequency coming off of LED bulbs, which means the bulbs themselves in some cases are giving off secondary signals or pulling in secondary signals. So I can understand we're in a classroom with kids that have nothing but fluorescent lighting and no exposure to regular light. It's not at all conducive to that sort of healthy light, your eyes, the receptors of the things that you witness every day, even the concept of your pineal gland, which is so close to what an eye is in the center of your brain. All of those frequencies are themselves are so responsible for mood, behavior, no different than electromagnetic frequencies, which are extremely responsible for mood and behavior. So, and then going into that jazz, you're talking about that same thing that's kind of going on in that transfer of information, whether it be light or people or energy. And you're alluding to the jazz world and that flow state that exists inside of all of that. That to me is like, I mean, I study jazz music, I play jazz music. I love to do it for the reason that it offers that exact sense of freedom and symbiotic relation between musicians, just like those moments that you're talking about. There are things that have happened on the most simplistic duo, trio, and quartet gigs at weddings and cocktail receptions that I've done that have been like, what just happened here? I can't believe what was created and the listening and the support mechanism of everything. There are things you couldn't pen out and come up with that you, later after the gig, you're sitting around going, wow, what a fun gig, because of those connections and because of those moments. And as a result, you kind of almost end up becoming like a junkie for those moments because they're
Sure.
so
unbelievable.
They're
Sure.
so like the paranormal. What just happened here?
Sure.
Like I'm getting a little
time.
like,
It's almost like
chills.
time almost suspends itself in a way. You know what's
Right.
interesting? You ready to have your mind blown? I think I'm going to blow your mind with this one. Okay. So they just came out with a new, not just, but 10 years ago, they started inventing this, and they've just developed it now for commercial applications. And the Get a Grip on Lighting podcast, which is my lighting show, was invited to the conference to display this to the world. And it's called Li-Fi, Light Fidelity Internet. And it's literally the internet signal travels across the light. Okay? So literally, that's the matrix, Ed. We're in the matrix now. Like literally, you're going to be in the internet, right? So, and then I'm talking to these guys about Li-Fi, and I actually did the world's first live stream over Li-Fi in the history of the world. My producer's name is Scotty, and I told him, beam me up, Scotty. Ha ha! Right? Right? Beam me up. So listen, let me get through this. So I said to the guy, so they're showing us that they have the Li-Fi, it's in the light. The light is sending the internet signal, no fiber optic cables, no copper, right through the light, okay? And we're streaming live to Canada, across the oceans like Greek gods. I'm appearing on screens everywhere in the world, right? In real time. And the guy's talking to me, and he says, not on the actual live stream, but on one of the scientists. And he's like, yes, here's the receiver. You plug it into your computer, and it receives the light signal. And I said, what do you need a receiver for? Why do you even have a receiver? I got 2 Li-Fi receivers right here, pal. Built by the natural selection, right? Why do we even need receivers for this? And then the next thing that was interesting is I spoke to this lady the other day who believes in the end of days, and she's like a revelation. She believes in the book of Revelation is being fulfilled in our times. And I thought, okay, this one's going to be fun. But she made a good point, and it was interesting. She talked about the pineal gland a lot, and about how the pineal gland is really what's guiding most of your decisions during the day. And it's interesting that a revelation person is telling me about this, and you're the second person now. These things seem to come in waves for me. But what was interesting was that she said, this is the second mind blow I've had in the last week or so. She said to me that, how could you not admit that you're in the end of days? I said, what do you mean? She goes, all the scientists agree with me. I'm like, what do you mean? She goes, what do you think global warming is? What do you think climate change is? That's the end of days. The scientists are talking to you right now, every day of your life. All you hear from your scientific priests, the priests of science, is that you're entering the time of revelation. John the Revelator told us about this 2,000 years ago on the island of Patmos, and now it's being fulfilled, and all of the priests of our time are predicting the end of days. And I thought, holy shit. Like she's right.
Patmos, you're talking about John of Patmos.
John the Revelator, man. John the Revelator.
Yeah, of course. And in some of that, I don't know if you remember, and you probably do because you seem to be biblically savvy, like a lot of people I know. It will be in the head or the hand.
Yeah, the sign of the beast.
Yeah. So what I find it interesting is that I spent a month living in New York, working, playing, releasing a video. I'm taken back by the amount of disconnect inside of in public behavior because of this. Continually, people walk around, ear canceling headphones, talking out loud. It seems to be always staring at their palm, right? Mm-hmm. And then you're mentioning the pineal gland and this connection to the thought process and the decision-making thing. Ancient cultures were very aware of what the pineal gland. I mean, even in the Vatican itself, there is a place called the Court of the Golden Pine Cone. And it's this huge. You were there. So you saw the chalice, and even on the Pope's staff, there is a pine cone that sits there. And the pineal gland over time actually degenerates as we get older. Some scientists and biologists have been looking at the ill-informed effects of certain aluminums and things that we have in cans. They even think that there's a higher percentage of Alzheimer's, which is related to the reduction of the pineal gland, which could be a result of consumption of a lot of soft drinks over a great period of time. And all of that means that detuning of and unattuned to who you are as far as higher thinking. This is even why in Indian cultures, the bindi is placed there as a form of a sense of consciousness that represents this sort of understanding and conscious-like behavior. Many of us, we may be not operating on what those things are for the very same reason that commerciality in some ways dictates our movements and how we buy, purchasing structures, what we do with the kids on the weekend, what are we doing for Christmas? Are we buying this for Christmas? Are we buying that? All of those things are so tied into that you cannot even think that somebody could use their pineal gland on a regular basis. So, and this is the interesting thing.
Or no. You know what? It's interesting. It's interesting. I'm going to interrupt you. Either you use your pineal gland, or someone else will use your pineal gland.
This is it. And when Bob was here, one of the reasons why he came for this test was because I have very little to no RF way out here in the boondocks. And some of the tests he wanted to perform were very similar to the Baxter tests. And I don't know if you remember the Baxter tests, but they were polygraph tabs that were hooked up to plants to try to determine whether or not there was a symbiotic relation between thought process directed at a certain thing, specifically a plant, and its relationship to something else in the room. And what the Baxter
I got to interrupt you on this.
What's that?
Someone just hooked up a Baxter rig to a MIDI control. They're using that to generate music.
Well, that's where I was going. Bob had these plans.
You interrupted him.
Oh, sorry. I'm
sorry. No, he
interrupted
interrupted you, my producer.
But we're on the same topic. That's what Bob was doing.
I love it.
He had an A to D converter hooked up to these plants that he actually first calmed down with a Tesla coil by tuning the floor in my studio and creating an artificial reverse phase that basically put the plants to sleep. And once that had happened, he had me start to play music with the plants, and the plants started to access through the A to D converter not only correct pitches but rhythmical similarities to what I was doing based on my interaction with them. And at that moment, this is where he started to go into his whole thing about the interdependence of all living things and how cause and effect is a real idea, and that despite that we know that we're doing it on a regular basis every day, we are. And the idea of talking to your plants or trying to understand what those subtle energies are all related to what you're just talking about. So this is what was staggering about the moment. The light transfer show that you were on, and that you're a part of this thing. Bob had a panel of either like 40 LED lights, and he hooked them up into his iPad, and they turned on, and he held them up in front of me. And he just said to me, I want you to try to stare at these lights as long as you can, no matter how long it takes, as best as you can. Try to cancel everything out and just try to listen in your head as to what song you may be hearing out of the blue. Just think about any song. Doesn't matter what song it is. I don't care what it is. Just think about a song. Okay, so he does this, and he goes into his pad. He obviously turns something on. The lights get a little brighter. Not much, just a little brighter. And if 10 minutes goes by, he's like, what do you hear? Just tell me the first thing. I'm like, I don't know. It's crazy. I don't know why I'm even thinking this. And he said, what is it? So I said, it's Simon and Garfunkel, Like a Bridge Over Troubled Waters. And he pulled the little thing out, and the speaker in his iPad was playing that Simon and Garfunkel tune. Now, I couldn't hear the music through his iPad. I didn't have on headphones. All I was doing was staring at this light board. And that's where we got into this heavy conversation about light transfer. You're talking about these are the
Li-Fi receptors.
Li-Fi. And it's going directly in. I think this is the concept of hardwiring, even the basic concept of a cochlear implant for some people. That's this hearing or visual aid that ties into the brain. All of a sudden, they can start to see imagery, 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional, black and white. But they can now start to interpret their visual space. Same thing with the ear versions of those. And those are tied directly into the brain, which are tied into the cerebral cortex, I think. And somehow the brain, through those electrical waves, are interpreting those signals. There is an electronic device. They are technically, in the weirdest of ways, sort of bionic. But as time changes, I think that cell phones and anything that we have that have a transmitter receiver concept will be irrelevant because you can pipe the information directly through light.
Yes, I agree with that 100%. But what worries me more is not that there's just something about Li-Fi that strikes me as extremely creepy. and I don't know what it is, but I want to change gears because there's something I want to ask you. So, you ever hear these relationships between like you hear like race and IQ and IQ and this and these people are smarter or this men are this and women are this, right? What always blows my mind when I read that is we don't understand how human intelligence at all. Because I want someone to take those numbers and then explain to me how some musicians can be so amazing. And like you look at music and there definitely is no difference by ethnicity or race in terms of the ability for people to make a beautiful music. And music almost comes out of them, and there's unique styles that come from their culture or maybe who they are. But I feel like that is an indication to me that when people starting getting into these metrics of who can pass more tests better than other people can pass tests, and this proves some sort of genetic thing that we can just do nothing about. It's so sad. It just is. It makes me very angry because like knowing the world is round or whatever, I don't want to put any stock in who can pass tests and what somebody did. I want to see people perform at a high level. And when I look for people performing at a high level, I see all types of people, men, women, black, white, Asian, everything. And they have these beautiful, unique forms of music emerge from various cultures. And it seems to be universal to me.
That's a big question and an interesting thing to explore, because right away my mind and thought process goes, and I can't help it because we're talking about music, my own personal journey. And when I look at other people's journeys, because we've got some wonderful documentation about what people have been through, so often there's some form of trauma that, and I laugh at it because every time I laugh at it, I win. I don't let the trauma get me. And I often talk about this with my brother because he's an automotive genius, and he's so good with his hands with so many different kinds of things. And I see him as an artist because of the way he thinks. I see many people as artists in our culture because of the way they're connected to what they do tactically. I've seen it in bulldozer operators, plumbers, electricians,
Sure.
All kinds of people. That I grew up on a farm, and growing up on a farm is like, wow, it's so nice. You got cows and chickens, and you're baling hay, and you're out in the summertime, and you're on a tractor. But the other side of living on a farm is the need for extreme caution because the potentiality of death.
Sure.
I lost a lot of friends. My buddy Chuck Sheepers was pulled through the combine, and his dad found him chopped up on the other side of the combine.
Oh, jeez.
We knew people that lost their heads because of PTOs coming off of the back of a tractor and coming loose and hitting them and killing them. You had to be able to do something that was related in plumbing, for sure, electrical. You had to understand animals, how they behaved, what they required. You had to understand how to grow food. You had to operate incredibly huge machines with that potential of the hazard of that something bad could happen. You were a veterinarian. You were working on a veterinarian level. There's medical things that you are now associated with. When I was 10 years old, I had my entire arm up a heifer's vaginal area to determine whether or not the cow's position was correct before birthing. I saw cesarean sections at the age of 8 with a cow in a barn, and the entire animal's side flipped open and a calf being pulled out of the embryonic sac. Then at the same time, you're working like hard all the time from morning until night. There are all these things that are always making your mind work on a high alert. This is one of the things about perception for me, which is tied into that high alert factor. How alert I am is my best friend and at the same time my worst enemy.
Sure.
Because all of that makes me hyper aware of what I'm doing, how it feels. And as a result, people say, wow, Ed's a really good musician. He's a great bass player. I appreciate those comments. But the reason I'm there today is because of my hyper awareness to my process. I think a lot of people that go through those hyper awareness moments, whether they be traumatic moments in their family, something where they were abandoned. We could look at Lennon's life as something very similar. I'm not John Lennon, but he's got a lot of trauma in his background. Look at a lot of the early blues musicians and jazz musicians and the things that they went to climb through the categories of what they had inside of a race and cultural issue. And now today they're heralded by many across all cultures, races, and religions as, amazing people as a result of those incredible stresses and traumas that they had to go through. This is what's interesting about art in general, is that it seems to be a continual navigation of the human condition as a result of those kinds of things. And that's why I find it so fascinating. It's borderline sociological. Even our archaeology itself represents some aspect to its connection to sociology and art. If you and I were to go and study a Minoan culture of yesteryear, you and I, man, Mike and Ed, that would be so cool. Down in the ground,
Go to Crete,
digging up some stuff. Yeah, get some brushes. Do the whole thing. We could go to Göbekli Tepe, one of the newer and most interesting. What do we see there? These depictions of things in pottery shards or stuff that is littered with day-to-day life, concept and thought, ideas about religion and life, and it's manifested in a vessel that people would have used daily and maybe ceremonially. All of those things are so intimately tied into the art form, and it even represent a struggle, perhaps some sort of an effigy or something that is scrolled on something that depicts that. So I see it coming out of the fluctuation of negative to positive. This is what I'm fascinated by. How does the dual word for destruction or catastrophe, I believe in either Japanese or Chinese, correct me if I'm wrong, is a duality word, which actually represents opportunity. Despite
what's that word, Scott? Scott knows that word.
Weiji.
Weiji.
Hey, thank you. Weiji.
Well, you know what's interesting?
I'm sure
it's interesting that you talked about being a farmer. There's actually a book I read years and years ago that talked about the impact of the reduction of farmers. His theory was that the collapse of democracy in the United States and the problems in our society and the struggle and the corruption and that actually correlates to the reduction in the number of farmers. And there's one thing this was his theory. There's one thing that you forgot in all the things that you listed of being a farmer. You also have to draw your own water and deal with your own shit. Right? And there's something spiritual about that, man. And there's no waste there. So I live on a farm too, but I don't actually operate the farm. But there's something about, my kids are like, oh, Dad, turn off the tap. You're wasting water. I'm like, we can't waste water here. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, the water goes back. It comes up over there on one side of our house, and it goes out over there on the other side of the house and goes back to from whence it came when we're done with it. And maybe there's a 1% loss or there's a 3% loss or something. And there's something to that fully, like, people are so specialized in a little niche, and they live in a little house, and they have their Facebook where everything is in an echo chamber of people that only agree with them. And there's very little adversity in their life. They want to have food, they can call Uber Eats. If they want to go somewhere, they can have a car come around the corner in 5 minutes, and they go wherever they want. But there's a deep sense of lack of purpose in all that that's killing people. There's they're not connected to their food in any way. They've never, one of the defining moments in my life when I was a young boy, I used to go stay at an in-laws farm in the country in the summer for a couple weeks at a time, and my brothers and sisters and I all go up there. And my cousin made me chop a chicken's head off, gut it, and pull all the feathers out of it. And then we ate it that night for dinner. And that was a spirit, like one of the things I remember more than anything else in my life is holding that chicken down as it squirmed. And he's like, you got to do this, man. I'm like, what are you talking about? I can't kill this thing. He's like, chop the head off now. And I'm like, and I just went, I chopped the chicken's head off and it didn't thing. And then it didn't kill it. And we had to crush the head. It was like a really brutal experience, man. I chopped the head, and then the thing didn't clean, and I had to crush it with the back of the axe, and it was, ugh. And then we took it, and we put it in the boiling hot water, and we pulled all the feathers out and took the guts, and then he was grabbing the inside of the guts and making it cluck or making some sound with it. He's like, oh, see? It was making some noise, and it was very impactful upon me. I never forgot that. And so many people that, whether they're vegans or vegetarians or whatever, I look at people and I say to myself, do you even know where your food comes from? Do you have any idea how it's grown? And I'm not being critical here, like to them. I'm not saying being a vegan is wrong or being a vegetarian is wrong or being a carnivore or whatever diet people want. It's none of my business, and I don't care specifically. But there's a deep disconnection in our society from where our resources come from and how we get them and how the process works and the mass slaughter of animals every day. Like, I think there's something like 100 million chickens in Canada at any given time. People get a plate of chicken wings and they don't realize that that's 20 dead birds. They have no connection. And those birds are Brazilian birds, actually. Or they're, there's 20 dead Brazilian chickens on their plate, right? And this disconnection, the disconnection between the plate and the farm and the shit and the water and the person drinking it and the person putting their refuse in it, these disconnections create a cognitive dissonance that makes people not understand the world in a way.
Sing it, brother.
I wish I could.
You know what? First off, I have to say, one of the wonderful things about speaking with you, Michael, is that you're a great conversationalist and you understand disagreement and you know how to interject in a way without it becoming a character assassination or volatile as a result of opinion. That's what can create, even in difference of opinion, healthy growth as a result of being able to understand. So I appreciate the way you're describing this and we're talking about this. The very aspect of toil, whether you're a vegan or you're a meat eater, point being is that there's struggle that occurs in the process of growing and looking after animals. I've had to kill animals in my life because of disease or for eating. Even at a very young age, I understood that something has to die in order for me to live. And as much as it killed me in that old Yeller kind of moment when I was young, I've come to grips with what it represents today. And it gives me a higher appreciation for what life actually is, that it is so precious and in some cases stable, but very unstable in regards of how we interact with it. That appreciation factor that you're talking about, for me, is now a need in my life. I have to grow food every year and grow an alarming amount of it, and always have and always will, because every day that I go out to the garden or I pick something or I'm interacting with it for 6 to 8 months of the year, I feel vindicated as a human because of that toil and struggle. It's bigger than like you just won 10 grand in a scratch and win.
Sure.
It's so, and that detachment that promotes that exact same thing. How did you word it again? The way that you said it was so beautiful.
It's a cognitive dissonance. It's a cognitive dissonance.
Is it cognitive or is it unconscious already to the point that you said, well, political structure has collapsed as a result of so many people that used to farm and now they don't farm as much. And then there's that sort of healthier way of living as time has gone on. What has made it conscious or not conscious? Has it been the change of the need to take over in our behavior, in terms of our behavior or how we behave? Is it this sense of ego that says, well, people don't have those kinds of responsibilities, so it's easier to corporately farm things and bring it in from further afield because people don't seem to really matter? Doesn't it make more sense to think about it as unconscious, if I could pose it that way, because now through one generation or two generations of people that maybe used to farm that don't farm now, their kids aren't consciously maybe thinking about it the way that their grandparents did. So is it this cultural divide as a result of conquest? Is it something through, some people may argue, overpopulation? And I'm still on the fence about what all that represents. Is it because of that sociological change in terms of demographics and farming and ecoculture and all of that other stuff? I also see a huge amount of people re-embracing those old ways and farmsteading or homesteading, or even having that basic connection to backyard growing is huge for people. Or, hey, let's put the kids in the car. It's Thursday. We're going to go to the farmer's market and support local farms. All of that is sort of circumnavigating that more conscious behavior on the other side of it again. So I think there's a lot of stuff bubbling right now in terms of our potential for re-grasping what that used to be, and or still people floating in the idea that it's irrelevant, and that cultural apathy that we're talking about because of change. I know a lot of people that don't grow, and I'm showing off my tomatoes or cucumbers or whatever's going on. They're like, well, I wish I could do that. And I usually invariably will say, well, why aren't you? If they're in an apartment, that's one thing. But if they're like, I can't, well, why can't you? I mean, the idea of that's the toil that I'm talking about. I don't understand. I have to figure this out. How do I break ground? What do I need to do to the soil? What am I going to plant? All of those things are part of the early toiling experiences that people are afraid to embrace because they're so separated from it. And so that there's so many things inside of your statement that are wonderful to sort of look at, because it's been ongoing. And as a kid, even like I'm almost 50, and I've seen such a shift in agriculture in this country, even our buying habits in terms of where we buy and where we purchase, or eating more locally or seasonally, has really changed. So, I mean, when I was a kid, go to Loblaws with your kid, or Nob Hill Farms in my case, there weren't any kiwi fruits. You know, there was like cabbages and turnips and squash and, you know, oranges for sure, and more clementines at Christmas, because that's when they all came in from Morocco, you know.
Sure.
And so that there's so many things that are going on with that detachment factor. It's almost a book or a course in sociology to look at, and it behooves us as people today think about it more clearly, and to diagnose it and look at it, or at least propose those questions or pose those questions, so that we could look in greater detail.
You know, it's funny, like you take a place like Ontario, and we're negotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement or the USMCA agreement or whatever it is. And in the past, you'd look at a country like Canada, and what we've inherited from our ancestors and our forefathers is a system of dairy quotas in individual provinces, right? Where it's like, this is how much milk we need to have milk security. And it's like, well, we dump the rest of the milk down the drain. And that's such a waste, and it's against the North American Free Trade Agreement, and we're violating that the dairy. I don't know how if it's a cooperative or how it's set up, but they each have these quotas, and you know, we set the price, and they make their money, and that's how it works. And they can artisanally make more cheese if they want, but then they can sell, but they can't be sold to supermarkets. And there's a complex system of food security, and I think we abandoned that at our peril.
It happened with the wheat board. The head of the wheat board, National Wheat Board of Canada, resigned because he felt he was getting no conversation or any kind of, you know, verbal connection to what was going on a political level, not just provincially, but on a federal level. And like you said, abandoning those things for the sake of convenience because we don't want to think about it is ignorance. I'm sorry to say it that way. And that's where I get angry about that kind of stuff, because, like, I mean, who's running the ship then? That's what scares me.
Well, I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, there is such a horrible vacuum of leadership in Western countries. It is just so bad right now, everywhere you look. But if you're negotiating a trade deal, okay, I got news for the Canadian people. If anyone's Canadian and listening to this, guess what? Canadians are probably the richest people to ever exist in the history of the world. Canada is an enormous country with a very small population. I think we have something like a quarter of the world's fresh water. We got timber, we got gold, we got iron, we got gas and oil. We have everything that we could possibly need or imagine. And if we enter into a trade deal and we make a deal that doesn't work for us, or that impoverishes us, or that in some way is focused on stupid issues, and I'm going to say something here, people may misunderstand what I'm going to say, but what right does Canada have to tell Mexico or the United States about women's rights? Why are we so hubristic and cocky and think that we have everything figured out here? Cut a deal that works for Canada and stay very focused on things like food and water and sustenance and protection of food security in these areas. Instead, people are talking about crazy issues that have nothing to do with this country lasting another 100 years or being independent on milk. Like, people say bad things about dairy and good things about dairy or whatever it is. But listen, I bet you like 50% or 40% of children's protein in Ontario comes from milk, right? And everything else is 50%. We need milk. We need milk security. And I think we've done a great job on it. And we abandon these systems and these things that, like, these things could be pillars holding us up that we're pulling out, not minor distinctions in economics, and it's a lack of farmers in the system knowing that, telling people that. That's the problem, right? And this goes back to that book I read years ago about farms in the U.S. and their correlation between political insanity and number of farmers.
It's actually an interesting premise, because free trade, you started off with that aspect. I remember in the 80s it being sold. It was going to be great, new businesses, easier to move stuff across border, all of that. That was the tip of the proverbial iceberg. There's so much more in terms of what free trade is that actually is part of what is the depletion process of healthy economics based on stability in farming and growth in economics. And so, for instance, a tomato paste company can go further afield for a cheaper bushel of tomatoes in Mexico, but they won't buy it from their backyard because it's $5 more, because they have a profit margin for their investors. And as a result, that's why they're doing what they're doing. So free trade allows them, and the tariffs actually are not as intense as a result. So now they have an increase in profit margin. So as a result, the family farm then either throws out the tomatoes, can't sell them, or whatever it might be. And now you have that disconnect between the company that's manufacturing and farm that wasn't that far away. So, and with that said, then you've got like that whole kind of like framework of very similar things. Who has the right to tell us that even with trade, or how much money we're giving to certain countries, that's also tied into, our extension over the proverbial barrel and who we are. Farms in the 1930s and 40s, especially post World War II, the Bank of Canada was giving, land grants to people to buy a farm. And the Bank of Canada, prior to between 29 and 74, was pretty much sitting at a stable $18 billion, which on a national level isn't nearly as severe as what it is today. And you had monies that were actually coming back in dividend checks that were being issued to septuagenarians and octogenarians because of residual money coming back to the bank. Those farms were something very easy for the Bank of Canada to get behind, which was also at that point in time still based on a gold and silver standard of the money that was in fluctuation, because they knew exactly what you just said. They would be pillars to certain things in our country as far as what we were trading amongst ourselves, or what was going on across border, which was still happening at that point in time. So it was a good idea to be handing out money. Prosperity, it's going to come back. Health and well-being of a nation, monies that could come back as a result of that. Well, 74, They changed that under the Trudeau administration. They opened the back door, private money lending at an interest rate. We never had an interest rate prior to 74 in terms of what that was. So with all that said, that's been another part of the demographic of the subtle collapse between farm and ecology, the bank itself that was stably supporting what those things were, and all those things that you mentioned, whether it be the dairy board, the wheat board, doesn't matter. They were all healthily propped up by a stable economy that went, hey, this is a good idea. And it ties into that same process of the book that you're talking about, which is where like, okay, so there's health and well-being and all the basic things that we need: water, food, health and well-being,
disposal of our sewage,
any of that stuff. And what the Bank of Canada actually even did at that point as far as infrastructure from St. Lawrence Seaway development and Trans-Canada Highway, schools, hospitals, all of that was under that element of $18 billion without interest. Now, between 74 and 84, it went from $18 billion to $408 billion within 10 years with an interest rate. So now we're overextended even as a country, even with the premises of the things that go on with the United Nations and giving out money, and $200 million to who?
Yeah, what's another 200 here? What's another $3 billion there?
It's all fat. And the pillars that you're talking about now have been reduced to
I'm gonna throw something else at you here real quick, okay?
Sure.
I believe in free trading of certain goods and services. I'm not against that. Okay, I think there are cars, corn, whatever, but there's certain things that we should protect, okay? But a bad trade deal, this is what Canadians need to hear. And I'm going to tell you a little anecdotal story about Finland in a second, because I love Finland. But so a bad trade deal is a reduction in your country's sovereignty.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
You make a bad deal. Yeah. Now, what do you mean? So they say, well, dairy is a violation of the USMCA, the dairy board. Okay, well, guess what? By this exact same logic, you could say that the Ontario Health Insurance Plan is a violation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. By the same logic, because the Ontario government is subsidizing the health care of their workers, and in the United States, we don't do that. Businesses have to pay. That's an illegal subsidy. So then they're going to be allowed to tell us that we're not allowed to have a publicly funded healthcare system because it makes our products cheaper, because it actually does. It actually is 50% of the cost. It's half price. Okay, healthcare in Canada is just as good as it is in the States, and it's half price, okay, because we have a publicly funded system. Now, the Americans could turn around and say, that's a violation of the free trade agreement. You're not allowed to do that anymore. Are Canadians going to put up with that? I think that's where we would draw the line. We'd say, you know what, screw you guys, right? We're not cutting a trade deal with you. Well, my proposition is let's move that line further down the line and say, you know what, we don't care about trade with you as much to get rid of our milk sovereignty. We want Ontario to have as much milk as it always needs, and we want to support those farmers. So let's move the line forward, because how much of our sovereignty are we going to give up? How much of because food security is sovereignty. That's what it is by definition.
You're totally right, Michael. Like, run for office because you got that right. I mean, I trade with who you want to trade. It's natural. That should be occurring, and in a logical fashion, without unrealistic attempts like traveling thousands and thousands of miles away, or shopping out certain business practices so that you can cut your rates.
Yeah, good trade is good, not free trade. Good trade.
Right. Good trade is good trade. And that sovereignty that you're talking about is so integral. It's no different than the money aspect. You point that out in terms of a deficit, in terms of what's been going on. And there was actually a public lawsuit, and the public won. Bank of Canada still hasn't owed up or onus up to what their, the comeback is for what this is in terms of what it represents. But you'd think, just by your statement alone, when healthcare becomes affected by what free trade deems it to be, or maybe what in a national North American different kind of agreement, which represents unilateral, cross-lateral abilities for whether it be the military, private investigation, police force, all of that you'd think would change the way Canadians say yes or no. But it doesn't. This is what can be alarming about some of these kinds of decision-making processes, that cultural apathy that we were mentioning before seems to be prevalent. in our decision-making process. Saying yes, no, this belongs to us, and that is a crappy deal, and saying no usually will end up being fodder for some kind of news media. Canada does not want to participate in such and such. It's then compensated by the negative in that regard, as opposed to two people saying, all right, you don't want to trade, we don't have to trade. Oh, I can go trade with somebody else, as opposed to then spreading a rumor that like so-and-so doesn't want to trade with me because they think this. But those are our decisions in terms of our sovereignty, and no different than tying it into the health and well-being of who we are. If you're giving away those very things that create our stability, and none as Canadians, we no longer have that stability, well, how are we then stable? I'm sorry to put it that way, but it's everything has been depleted to that point. And
we're only as stable as the trade deal continues to work.
Canada is one of the most, it's almost utopian in the sense of what we have here. We have microclimates for growing all kinds of food. We can grow practically, other than some citrus and stuff like that, in terms of the type of climates that we have, the geography that we have. There's mineral resources. There's so many different things that we have here as a repository of wealth. But we don't see it that way. And I'm sorry, but that cultural apathy really ties in that sense of laziness. I don't want to grow a garden because I just don't want to. I can go to the grocery store and buy it. Well, that's your choice. But in my mind, subtly, I say to myself, and I'm sorry, I'm not saying that person is lazy, but why? Because you're not actively doing it and doing it enough for that sense of toil to understand the appreciation. Once you do it enough, it's not that. It becomes integrated into your very fabric of who you are. It's not like, I know every year I got to go pick weeds or deal with what I have to deal with in my garden because I have to. I don't like doing it. I'll tell you right now, I hate pulling weeds. My hands get sore, my wrists get sore, and I want to play my guitar, and that's not overly conducive to playing. But I do it, and when it's done, that toil, that thing, that sense of appreciation goes, boom, look back at the row that you just hoed. Damn, that looks good. Man, I'm happy I did that. They're going to get bigger. All these things that start flashing through your minds like, yes, this is why I do it. And dude, Michael, I mean, we could go on and on and on talking about all of that in terms of its cultural significance. But it's funny. It's when I speak with my mom and a lot of times older people, where she hates to admit that she feels as a society we've become weak.
We have. She's 100% right. She's 100% right. It's interesting because it's interesting. Like if you look at history, strength doesn't arise or power doesn't arise in the other because like when you watch these things that change, power arises because of the weakness of the other, not because the strength of the one becoming powerful. You understand? Like these castles we build crumble, my man. And it's like everything is a Tower of Babel. Eventually, the bottom can't speak to the top anymore. You know what I'm saying? Everything becomes like a Tower of Babel. And right now, we're at the top of a Tower of Babel, and people are like, I don't want to be so critical of people, but people can be completely, like you hear people in Canada complaining about Donald Trump. And look, I don't care what you think of Donald Trump. Can you name your local member of council? Because that person has way more of an effect on your life every day. Did you even vote in the last election? I mean, I had this kid in my warehouse. He was working in the light. He's picking bulbs. And he's like, "What do you think about Trump? You're going to vote for Trump?" I'm like, "Dude, I'm a Canadian, man." And yeah, he's a simple kid. Okay, he doesn't get it he doesn't even understand that Canadians don't vote for Donald Trump. It's like, who cares who the U.S. president is? It's got nothing to do with us. But Canadians are so sucked in to this constant drama in the United States, this total collapse of political compromise. It's so sad to see people that can't sit in the same room together and come up with policies that help their country. It almost breaks my heart. And then to see the same thing start to happen in Ontario and in Canada, it's so heartbreaking. How come you can't sit in a room and discuss a few issues where you have some minor differences on and move forward, man? You guys are sitting there spewing hatred. It's like the United States has become like this enormous, wealthy, spoiled, rotten, dysfunctional family that's disgusting to watch. It's disgusting to me.
I'm laughing at it because your delivery is comical, and this is the thing. It's
a comedy of errors, though. It really is.
Ask Canadians who was the prime minister between Mulroney and now. Who are all the prime ministers? But they'll tell you who the last 4 presidents in the United States were.
Sure.
And that we're inundated with that part of culture. What I've come to learn and understand as an American, because we live in the Americas.
Sure.
We're Canada, that is the United States of America.
We're an American state. We're not united. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. We are different for that invisible border only because we say so. And the same thing with Americans. I've spent a lot of time working and living in the U.S., and I know many Americans that are ashamed of what's going on politically and feel that it's a great reflection on them, despite that they don't agree with it. But like politics has created such discourse as a result of lack of diplomacy, egotism, unscrupulous dealings, clandestine behavior that's created this incredible
special interest groups.
Yeah. And Canadians are sitting here like with our marshmallows, watching it on nightly news, coming at us 247, and we cannot help but generate these, in some cases, false opinions. I think that exact rhetoric about what we were just describing is partially there, but it's not, because I know so many Americans that are amazing people that are just feel like they don't know what to do. They don't know how to correct the issues because there is so much corporate overtide that's tied into what government, and especially in the United States, actually is. Most Americans don't even realize that the Federal Reserve is not even a faction of the federal government. They're a privately instituted organization that controls and fluctuates the amount of money in the United States. And with that means, well, who owns the currency of the United States itself? I feel sorry sometimes for Americans because they almost feel like lost in what the American dream was. As Canadians, I don't even think we've still yet figured out who we are on the map, because we're so fixated on other things that go on that just like you said before, what's going on in your municipality? Who's your local? Did you vote? Kinetically, those kinds of things are what makes, sorry, I hate using this word, politics, but public service.
Service, that's the right way to say it. Yeah.
It goes from a municipal level. People are working hard, having kids, paying their mortgages, doing what they're doing, connecting, voting. And then it goes to the provincial level or state level. It's the same thing. But on those levels, I've even seen, you're talking about where things go and protecting our resources. Look what happened with the Liberal government and the private deals with the windmill companies. Up where I am, 90% of that energy goes to the United States.
And we pay them to take it. And we pay them to take it.
And not only that, when the Auditor General for the Ontario government came out and said, I don't know what to do, I'm going to resign. Technically, what's happened here is a law, or a violation of the laws. There was no cost-effective analysis benefit ever done of any of this stuff. People are getting private pays off. They're getting 125-year contracts on this stuff. It's all illegal, and nobody cared.
Well,
nobody cared.
You know what? I'm going to tell you something. And there's so many different directions. I was making all these notes as you were talking. It's so many different.
Me too, bro. I'm just covered here.
Yeah. So I'm going to take this one first. Okay. So what are the 3 major scandals in Ontario in the last 15 years? Okay. So you have the e-health scandal, you have the Green Energy Act, and you have the gas plant scandal. Okay. And you know what? There's 3 people involved in all 3 of those. Dalton McGuinty, the Kathleen Wynne, but there's one more guy. George Slippery Smitherman. That guy cut more bad deals for this province than any other politician that you could dream of or imagine, dude. And it's Ontarians, Ontario is like the Switzerland of North America. Canada is really rich, but Ontario is super rich in terms of, like, Alberta's rich because of one thing. Ontario is just diversification rich, banking, art, farms, forests, mines, everything except for oil. Okay. But we have it's like Switzerland. Okay. But, we can only behave like this because we're so rich. Like, there's just so much wealth being created in Ontario that we can allow our governments, and I'm going to say progressive, conservative, whatever. We can allow our governments to behave so ridiculously irresponsible. And I picked on the Liberals. I'm going to pick on the PCs right now. Like, all of a sudden, Doug Ford comes out with a press release saying, we're selling beer we're going to shut down the beer store. And I'm sitting here thinking, dude, what? That's all you got, man? Cheaper beer for the masses? Like, oh yeah, we're gonna rip that deal up with the co-op, and you know what? Like, hey, guess what, man? There's a lot of people who work at the beer store, actually, dude, and you just screwed with their futures. And maybe you want to think about this a little bit more before you give everybody a buck off a 2-4 to buy a vote in the next election. It's disgusting, dude. And that Ontarians put up with this is unbelievable to me.
You know what? You're right. And that's what I was getting about the scary factor behind it, and that unconscious behavior behind rage. Rage is an important thing. Anger. When you get up, Mike, and you're talking about what you're doing, and I see your body language, and you start speaking quicker, and the information is coming because you're so passionate about it and everything that's going on. Somebody say, hey, whoa, relax, man. You're getting worked up about all this. Good. Those kinds of things actually need to occur. And people, without being an asshole, sorry to say it that way, or hard-edged or egotistical about it, need to say no.
Yes.
To certain people. One of the things that my dad found interesting about his tenure as a political servant, and I hate saying that, public servant, as a politician. He was mayor of Markham for over 30 years. He was police commissioner for 14. He was chairman of York Region for 6. And he was the first ever coalition candidate in the history of Canadian federal politics that ran as an independent, ousted both the conservative and the liberal leaders at that time, John Gamble and Aldo Tallis, won, and came to understand far more about the interior of what I call crypto politics and sort of what Mussolini may have called corporate fascism, which really sort of exists inside of the provincial and federal framework of politics. Now, these dealings that you're talking about, and the spreads and circuses, to placate the masses on these aren't people that are thinking about the longevity and the health and well-being of a nation. They're more interested in gleaning their pocketbooks for the moment, and the byproduct of this, who cares? The sense of responsibility that belongs to a public servant is a sense of responsibility. It is, in fact, what I am doing is the voice. I am the representative person of this body of people. I am not the governor or to govern over, as a government does, over the decision-making process of its people. The idea of the political structure inside of a democratic republic is that all voices can be heard, those choices are made, a decision is based on a vote, and that vote becomes the standard. Those things don't necessarily occur in what I call clandestine corporate politics. They're more about the design of what will benefit those that are involved. You're talking about one group of people or one person that may be involved in a number of different bad dealings. The same thing happens in in the very structure even of like the United Nations and its very founding and the way that it works.
Mm-hmm.
The League of Nations was a failed idea, and that's why we have the United Nations. People thought, and actually after the First World War, what all that represented was a very poor decision-making process that would eventually end up corrupt and being controlled by a few. Well, David Rockefeller, coincidentally, and the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller family, Goat Island, the building itself, the United Nations, Trilateral Commission, Council on Foreign Relations, its relation to the Club of Rome, all of those things are directly related through much of what David had put most of his life into in order to conglomerate the Western and the Eastern hemisphere of this planet in order to be able to control more of their decision-making processes. It works the same way in federal politics in terms of even systemic methodology. When you've got people inside of politics that are great people, amazing, brilliant minds that could actually, really be doing so. They're doing the strangest of things, but still yet gleaning information for a hierarchy that's actually running behind the scenes in the decision-making process. You can even look at somebody like Henry Kissinger. He's been in federal politics in the United States since prior to the Nixon administration, and he's still there as an advisor.
He was Nixon's right-hand man, dude.
Yeah, of course. And not only that, he was Rockefeller's right-hand man. Much of what they dictated through Rockefeller came through Kissinger and sort of the ideas of what best suited the United Nations and their agenda, even when it came to foreign affairs, when it came to how they became involved in wars overseas. All of that was really directly, clandestine. And then it pops out in these little ways. There are always scapegoats inside of those factions of certain things, where now it's easy to blame a certain political official that's been elected. But in essence, it's really not pointing the finger at the bigger part of the problem. So with my dad being in those positions and those decision-making processes, or even at being asked across the floor, or seeing corruption, money, taxpayers' money going out the window, okay, you've got an MP that has given an apartment to live in, free travel by aircraft and plane all over this country at their disposal, not only for them, but their family. They would rent out their apartment. They would get the money for their per diem that they would normally get and keep the rent, even though taxpayers were paying for that apartment. They would abuse their Via Rail passes. They would abuse their Air Canada passes, all at our expense. So even on a basic level, those kinds of things where politicians were, well, I'm a politician, I have this right. You should be humbled. And ego and any of those kinds of things should not actually be coming up into the agenda of who you are. You are there to serve the nation, your municipality, your province. Most people, even in the big roll-up mechanism of what an election is, are all swooned into, oh, look at his suit, and I love his hair, and all these little tidbits and things that are totally irrelevant to who the person is. I'd rather have a farmer running this country than somebody that was groomed through an echelon of an Ivy League school or has some tenure to family past.
Some princey.
Yeah, because it's not actually somebody that wants to be there to help in terms of the health and well-being of the nation, and to be thinking about it in multiple generations of what that decision-making process is. I'm going off.
Yeah, no. You're not talking about rage or anger, though. You're talking about moral indignation.
You're right.
Right? Moral indignation is unique. It's a unique form of anger. And it's an extension of the contempt mechanism, right? So so moral indignation is the feeling that comes when one is experiencing contempt, right? So, contempt is a dangerous thing, and moral indignation can be a very dangerous thing. It could also be a very helpful thing because people feel reason in it. But you mentioned Justin Trudeau, and it's interesting because, like his father before him, he's an expression of Canada's inferiority complex as a nation. Okay? He is an egotistical narcissist. And the only reason people voted for Justin Trudeau is because they wanted Canada to be seen and heard on the world stage. They wanted Canada to make noise and get the paparazzi after them in Washington and London and Brussels and Shanghai or Beijing. And they didn't care about anything else. They just wanted to have somebody that could command the interest of the U.S. press. Because, Stephen Harper, I didn't think he was a bad prime minister, but it felt like if you took his head off, there'd be a computer inside of it. You know what I mean?
Oh, it was 3 lizards at a poker table.
Oh, you're getting political, Scott. Whatever it is. I felt like he was kind of android-like in a way, right? And it's like he's so boring. And so Canadians wanted some paparazzi. They wanted Kim Kardashian to be their prime minister in a way. And that's what Justin Trudeau is. He's like this vomiting out of the Canadian ego that feels like it's not as good as it could be. And we need a good looking prime minister that can, turn heads in Washington and London and Beijing. And it's gross, dude. It's gross that we would make that kind of a decision.
Where was that learned though from? Look at Diefenbaker. He wasn't like, Ryan Gosling.
No,
or something that the girls.
No, this
would
comes
fall
from.
all
No,
over.
no. I would have said Instagram or Facebook to you that it came from that. But you know what? His father was kind of the same thing in a way.
Oh yeah.
His father was like there was something, and I people would say that there was something clownish about Pierre Trudeau. He was like a clown in a way. He did that little, when he was signing the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, he did that little pirouette behind the Queen. Like, what a disgusting maneuver to do at a time like that. What a fool you are. Embarrassing us as a nation. Like, I'm going to sign this document or whatever he did. It's, to me, you look at that and it's like, what an expression of the ego. It's like, you know what? It's like Hitler standing outside the train car, man. It's the same feeling I get with Justin Trudeau. This covert, egotistical narcissism just emanating out of him. I'm going to put 50% of my cabinet as women. Why is that, Mr. Trudeau? Because it's 2015. The sneering, pompous narcissism is so disgusting. And I don't know why, but the problem with narcissism, the problem with egotistical narcissism is that it only offers 2 options to people. So when I was in my ego, I only offered these 2 options to people. And it was sad that I lived so much of my life wasting my time in my ego. And I pray for gratitude every day to God because it's so wonderful not to be there. But when someone's in their ego, there's only 2 things that you can do. You can either validate their ego or you can go into conflict with them. That's the sign. Right? And if you don't validate their ego and you don't go into conflict with them, the relationship will evaporate from your life because it's fueled by the conflict or the validation. And Justin Trudeau or George Smitherman or Donald Trump, their power is fueled by the validation of their egos that goes on Twitter and on, in the media and this divide. And so the only thing we have towards our leaders is this conflict or validation response. And it's so subhuman. It's so tribal. It's so below our higher purpose that it just makes me sick to my stomach. But all you see is validation or conflict. And why is that? Because we're a nation. We're nations of egotistical narcissists.
The triumph of the ego. I've heard this many times and mentioned before. You mentioned all those people, Trump or whoever it might be. This is really, from what I've come to understand about maybe what some may call a hidden agenda. And the only reason I even facilitated the thought process of whether or not it would be real or not, for the sake of being heralded a conspiratorial freak or something like that, was because of my father and my uncle. Both very well read, both consorted with people that today, when I tell them, don't believe me. And had international dealings, my uncle, with, and I mean, the Pope John Paul II was my uncle's friend. He blessed the Cathedral of the Transfiguration in Victoria Square, where I grew up. Okay, he was present at Vatican II to determine whether or not the divinity of Christ was a reality. Nixon, Mulroney, Trudeau all dined at my uncle's house. This wasn't about ego. This was about my uncle being the kind of person that he was, which was came from nothing and stood for the rights and freedoms of all religions and people around the world to try to create a new idea of who we were as Christians, let's just say. As a result, many political people then tried to swoon him into certain things, whether it be organizations, Knights of St. Gregory, my parents, Knights of Malta. They're all factions of the tiers of the sort of Vaticanary disciplinary studies and tiered systems of things that go through that process, which you could even be considered connected to the Illuminati. I've read a couple of books by some people, one of which was Anesta Webster. And one of the things about going why I mentioned the Trump thing to start off with is because this is who you really want in a position of power, is an egotist, somebody that has unbalanced brains. One of Nesta Webster's statements was that as far as her talking about what she described as the sect, was that people with money were welcomed into the sect but kept oblivious to its overall purpose. We will enlist people with unbalanced brains and egos, as well as enlist adepts as well as morons in order to serve the purpose of the sect. You're talking before about your health and well-being of a country based on pillars and standards that were like farming and basic things, and a political system that wasn't as corrupt. That then changes. You have all these new rules and regulations as a result of the way that we behave, eat, sleep, function. We have people that we question their very moral values of the decision-making process that are supposedly in charge. And as a result, it creates the perfect framework of chaos, which means it's next to impossible to try to clean up that mess. This is what becomes the dangerous mechanism inside of hemispherical takeover, is that then the problem gets so rampant and so amassed into like a cancer that somebody will be able to come in very quickly and offer the solutions. They can figure out how to manipulate this. No, we're not going to do that anymore. Yes. They look like, just like Hitler did to a nation. It's very similar in the fashion of creating a complete catastrophe and then involving a salvator, somebody that is going to be there to create the fix-its. And then as a result, the framework of everything changes again in a way that it will never, ever be the way we're describing it right now. So this is what I get when I say before, trying to navigate the premise of what all this change represents, how long this change has been occurring, looking at the social demographic of what those changes represent, like you're mentioning the three major catastrophes, sort of, not catastrophe, but things that happened with the e-trading thing, and you're talking about the green engineering,
e-health,
right?
Yeah.
All of that stuff that fluctuates the human condition into discourse and argument.
Yes.
Seems to be always a proponent of political change behind the scenes. You could even arguably say during the Lincoln administration that the idea of abolition and freedom of slaves and everything, this is a great proportion of the feeding of the fuel of the fire between the North and the South, which led to the Civil War and eventually a reformulation of what the American government actually represented. And a change, a stable change for many, many years. And now we're going through that same process. What's really interesting about all that and scary is that we don't see those factions of change until hundreds of years, sometimes after they occur. Yeah. We are actually living right now inside of one of those fluctual changes, and we don't actually even realize it. Even though many of us are sitting around talking about it, writing about it, having the porch chat, coffee chat about all this stuff, we know it's there. But in essence, like people of yesteryear, whether it been that or something that maybe even initiated the First World War with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, all of those same kinds of things throw us into political discourse, and boom, we have the ability to change things behind the scenes. I would even argue something like 9/11 has that same impact. Prior to 9/11, you didn't have the suspension of habeas corpus in the United States, nor did you have the Patriot Act or the 9/11 Act or the Home Security Act. All of those things, like you said before, diminished, again, more of the rights and freedoms of the average American as a result of that one event.
You know, it's interesting. It's interesting. And this is, I don't know if what you're saying is true. Okay. That's
neither do I.
At the risk of being a conspiracy theorist. But it's interesting. So I've actually, a couple things I'm going to tell you here that there's so many great topics you're going on. But so the first thing is that I remember, so I've been sued. I somehow, for whatever reason, unfortunately, in my life, I've gotten involved in a lot of legal cases. I've been involved in the Superior Court as a witness and as a defendant. I've been in the Small Claims Court as a defendant and a plaintiff. I've been before the Labor Board as a support person, and I've been before the Human Rights Tribunal in Ontario. For whatever reason, I'm only 41, but I've been before all these different things. And what I've learned and from observing this is, and this is always my counter to, okay, there could be a conspiracy, but it's important that we shouldn't assume malevolence, Ed, when incompetence can be replaced just fine. You understand?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like if incompetence will do the job, it's probably more likely that it's all incompetence rather than malevolent or some scheming plan. You know, like in our ignorance looking at it, we think, well, someone must be benefiting from that and making millions of dollars and there must be some backhanded deal or whatever. If the same thing could have happened just by the sheer incompetence of the idiot in charge, it's more likely sheer incompetence. And that's what I've seen.
Absolutely.
I've seen over the years. The second thing I'm going to say is, and I wrote this down, that fools and tools. Now, if you believe that there are people that have Machiavellian intentions and cook up their machinations with their friends and deploy long-term control strategies where they're able to get the results they want, if that happens, for sure they use people as fools and tools. And I know because there was this one person, I'm not going to say too much because they might be a listener to the show, but she's a fool. And when I need to create chaos in a situation, like if I'm being sued and I just want the person to be delayed and just realize that they're dealing with a fool, I send her in. And she's the worst practitioner at this possible. But what she does is she's so bad that she gums up the process and drains the other side of energy and of power. And the problem with employing a good lawyer is they kind of manipulate you, and the two lawyers get together and like, well, this is going to be the deal. And you're going to get paid this much and that much or whatever, and we're going to get it done. What you really want most of the time is a really incompetent, low conscientiousness lawyer that's going to forget dates, that's going to not fill out things properly, that's going to respond irrationally to the other side. So nobody knows what the hell is going on and nothing can get done. Right? So smart people or people that cook up these machinations, they learn how to use people to do things that are the opposite of what people would think they want to do, but achieve their results, right? So they'll send in a fool, they'll send in a tyrant, they'll send in an egotistical narcissist because they know it's not that they care about being well represented or whatever it is. They know that that particular institution works like this, and that person will throw a wrench in the spokes of that institution and screw it all up, right? And smart people do that. So to say that maybe there's some smart people at the top of the world that are thinking to themselves, maybe they're in, Brussels, maybe they're in Washington, maybe they're in Beijing, or maybe there's multiple powers and principalities fighting one another in this game. I don't know. And maybe that's what Facebook is about. But if that's true, then there's evidence to support your theory. on an anecdotal level, on a lower level, that people can be used to just sabotage things or delay things or to sap someone's will to the point of apathy. And do I think that's happening to people? Yes, I think that's happening to people. They're having they're being sapped of their purpose and their humanity and their soul. Right now in our society, is somebody trying to do that to them? Maybe someone is trying to do that to them. I don't know.
Well, you're a beautiful human for thinking and believing what you believe, because
Thank you.
It seems, in a sense, worthy of saying, I'm always looking for something that is truthful, even how bad it could be, even because it is the truth, whatever it is, or how good it could be. That Machiavellian aspect to any conspiratorial factor is so easy to point out, and there's an interesting trail. That's like when you were saying to me before, I want to question you on that, and I love that about this conversation, because I don't know. I can't, even in my own decision-making processes about thinking about what this information represents, sometimes I'm only saying it's like pointing out these dots. And as you put the dots together, you think, well, this could be a probability. Just like you said, even if that is a probability with a 5% ratio, it's still concerning to look at, just like even in the fanciful. So it's healthy to think about it in a positive way, as opposed to it being this, Death Star-like thing that's hanging over our heads on a regular basis. And the fools and tools comment that you made is so true, because I'm not sure what ignorance is. Is ignorance knowing too much so that you can't actually just function and be happy and live inside of the experience? Or, is ignorance just, not making the right decisions based on all of these silly things that placate our ego and our little wants and needs for certain things other than basic sustenance? Why do you need a new car every year? I don't. I just need four wheels and a good engine to get.
Yeah, but even though you're saying that, you don't care if your neighbor goes and buys a new car. I don't think that's what you're saying, right? But
no, yeah.
I think you said, what is ignorance? I think it's interesting. I think you need to think of ignorance not in terms of a set value or a prescriptive outcome or a prescriptive mindset. This is an ignorant person, this isn't. I think you have to think of ignorance as a journey through life. And there's a time for ignorance, and there's a time for beautiful hope at the future, and there's a time to experience death and sadness, and your ignorance to death and sadness is taken from you. And there's a time for these phases in your life. And if you look at your ignorance, it's really just your journey through life. And as your journey through life, you should become less and less ignorant. And with that, you pay a price. You pay a price for that. But it's called wisdom.
Right. That's so true. And I'm thinking of the bird song, "A Time to Die."
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's actually from Ecclesiastes. Right. That's biblical. But yes.
I know, of course it is. And I'm just thinking of the song that relates.
Of course.
But yes, you're right, Ecclesiastes. But what then can I circumnavigate this thought? That if somebody, and you're so right, it is life experience that creates tenure. That sense of, I'm not ignorant to that because I went through that experience. So I understand it. I know what the pitfalls are. I know what the positivities are. I know what it is and what it isn't. What is it then? Is it then lack of conscience through a person's continual experience that keeps not seeing it for what it is and keeps making those exact same mistakes? Is that a part of conscious thinking inside of what changes you from being ignorant to what it is to how we develop into understanding it? Is that a sense of false hope or faith that If I run into that jungle, there probably won't be a lion in there, but there was last time, and I ran in again, and there's still a jungle in the lion, or a lion in the jungle.
There's still a jungle in the lion too in the zoo.
There's still a jungle. Yeah, I'm thinking Krishnamurti. That's my dyslexia coming in. That sense of like, okay, so I still haven't learned my lesson. Why am I repeating these things over and over again? Am I ignorant? Am I ignoring it? Is there something else in my existence that's impeding me from whatever those changes may be that makes me realize I understand this now?
The question, is your answer.
I guess you're right.
That question is your answer. When you're doing that, when you're engaging in honest self-reflection, when you're trying to figure out what the problem actually is, when you're seeking out truth, that is the quest for wisdom. Because if you know what the problem is, right, at least, okay, so now you're not ignorant of it. Maybe it's dark and dirty. Maybe it's disgusting. Maybe it has something to do with some sins you have committed in your life or whatever it is. But if you know what the problem is, you've sought out the truth, at least you have the opportunity to fix it.
And that becomes choice, I guess.
That's free will.
That's free will. So here we are to something, come into this line of entropy, into the singularity of understanding that free will, and it's so spiritual and connected to dogma, is really a baseline factor in even the feeding of the black wolf or white wolf, the positive side of the force, the negative side of the force, the yin and the yang. They must be necessary dualities.
You have to integrate the whole. There's all this theory, like there's a lot of theory from Carl Jung out, which talks about integrating the dark and that's the yin and the yang, that's the black and the white wolf. All of cultures have this. All of us humans, all of our ancestors, as we traveled around the globe, would express the same ideas in unique, meaningful, and beautiful ways. And you have this polarity. We know there's an evil and a good. We know there's a dark and a light. And it's interesting. I was talking to that Dr. Joy Pugh the other day, the one with John the Revelator. And it's interesting because you often hear from Christians, the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing the world that he didn't exist. You know what? I think that's wrong. I think the greatest trick the devil ever played was convincing you that you don't exist. And it's like this idea that there's no evil. I'm a good person. Everybody's a good person. You're okay just the way you are. Like, you couldn't say anything worse to anybody than you're okay just the way you are. No, you could be so much more than you are. If you choose the path of wisdom, if you choose the path of self-reflection. And so many of us in the West, we're stuck in Facebook. We're stuck in our egos, like me, stuck in your ego. You can only be validated, or you can only go into conflict. If you don't validate me, we go into conflict. There's the polarity. Validation, conflict, dark, light. There's all these polarities we're existing in. And I think what we're seeing is maybe we are seeing the end of days in a sense, Roman. Ed Roman.
That's okay. Well, you know what? What I've come to understand from reading and listening to some catastrophists, one of my favorite to listen to these days is a gentleman named Randall Carlson.
Oh, Randall's awesome. Yeah. Tell me what you love about him.
And everything. I want to scratch his beard. I've even written a personal letter saying, dude, if you want me to on one of your treks out to the Dakotas or something, I'll just go get coffee. Just so I can hang out with you, he's just, sacred geometry, his connections into history, his greater understanding for, the whole idea behind the Ice Age and the geographical changes and obviously things that have occurred, is that this is the rule of the universe, is continual change that is going through destruction and regrowth. This is the yin and the yang. It is the negative side of this is no longer here, loss of life, all this terrible catastrophe and everything. But what springs forth from what that is new potential. And the greater consequence of the decision-making process of an ever-changing universe that is growing and expanding and spanning. In some ways, I don't think, Zeta Reticula carries whether or not we bought 12 or 24 rolls of toilet paper. All those things that we're so tied into, which seems significant to us, when you're talking about the concept of evil, which really degrade us, remove us from who we are, who we really are, based on all these simple, like silly, as I said, decision-making process is not really a part of the form of higher time or a sense of or a sense of consciousness to the very living moment that you're in, as well as the people you're experiencing it with. So when it's arrested by so many things that placate the human condition, from, we could just make a list and keep going, it's really hard for, and this is why I guess art and the art form itself, or music for me, has that ability for great conscious reflection, which maybe in through my own ego is necessary for me, for my own health and well-being. Dude, when I have a good conversation with somebody, and I've learned so much from you, the stuff I've written down,
too.
3 pages of stuff.
Yeah, me too.
I feel vindicated. I feel vindicated, not just because I got the opportunity and I'm on the show and all that, but I really feel that's huge. I really feel more enlightened.
Me too.
As a person, even the things that you questioned me on, and all of that makes me feel like, right, this is life experience. I don't care about the cup that I might be drinking my coffee out at the moment in time, or a new phone, or any gadget or whatever. Those are all just practical tacticals. They're not really me. My art is me. The conversations that are born from this kind of a moment, which inevitability have before and probably will lead to lyric and idea and thinking, and all of that is rich for me.
Yes,
it's not even, you can't buy it. You can't, all it is this, it's the spiritual paycheck. I don't know however you want to look at it, but it makes you feel realigned. And talking about the bad things and the good things are, again, bringing the realization of why that yin and yang exists. Somebody said to me the other day in an interview, a while back actually, do you think that if you didn't have a learning disability that you'd be playing music today? And I had a hard time answering the question, because I know it's my personal struggle with reading and writing for so many years that gravitated me towards instruments, which gave me a sense of freedom to express myself without all the other trappings of academia that seem to be necessary.
Can I ask you another question like that?
Yeah.
If you weren't you, would you still be you?
No, I don't know. I don't think so.
Right. Well, there's the answer to the question.
I'm defined by my experiences, so that's where I was going. I don't think I would, because it's that very problem that people told me I had. But now, where I sit today, no, it's a gift.
Yeah, sure.
The very thing that they exactly. And it's like in the Paulo Coelho book of The Alchemist. It's not the gold at the pyramids that's the ultimate thing inside of the. It's the journey, exactly. You know, whereas you've read the book, so you get and that's the same thing. No, I probably wouldn't be me.
Hey, that's a great question. Like, it's a good way to ask it. Like, if you weren't you, would you really be you? Would you still be you? No, of course not, dude. You know what? You're a temporal being. You're a temporal being. You live in time, right?
That's right.
You know, there's at every second there's millions of you. There's you now, there's past you, and there's future you, and those are all the same guy. You know, they're all you. And can you forgive yourself? Can you forgive others? You know, or are you gonna live a life of resentment and envy, or are you gonna heed the call to adventure and strike out into the world and make something of it and make it better? That's the call to adventure. That's the spirit of the. You know what's interesting is that I've been following that guy Jordan Peterson a little bit. I find that guy interesting. He said something that blew me away. He said something like I was always a Catholic in my life, but now I'm really super deep into my Catholicism, because he said something that blew me away. And he said The Redeemer is he who is the message of the death and resurrection of Christ. Is this. The Redeemer is he who has died and is reborn. Right? And if you think about it, in a sense, we can be reborn. You can stop doing the bad things you're doing and start doing the good things that you know you should do. And if you do that, your life will be better. Our world will be better. If you choose that, if you're going to be one of the person that puts choices in the positive ledger of our nation and our world, or are you going to be someone that puts choices into the negative ledger? Because there's a competition between those two things, and we need more people to choose to do the right thing, to choose to live in peace, to choose to forgive one another, to choose to grant clemency, to love and be loved. This is what we need in our world. We don't need acrimony and insults and minimizing and racism and counter-racism and judgments. And we need people to make the right choices. And all these choices are listed in the various religions of our human heritage. It's in all of them. They all say the same thing. They all have, I think Christianity is the best one and the most powerful one. And if you look at cultures right now, maybe it is. Who cares? The message of Christ is the same message. It's the same. Do it and and make your life better. Choose wisdom and over ignorance as you go through your temporal journey. People need to hear this now. They need to know that you're not okay the way you are. You can be more. You can be better. Your life can be better. Your pain can go down. You're like so many people that suffer physical pain is like you can see them. Maybe they have a cane and they're in a wheelchair or they've hurt themselves. But many people are in deep emotional pain, Ed.
Oh, I know. And they don't even know it.
Yeah.
And they can't even articulate it sometimes. And the quick fix it of whatever it may be to placate the moment isn't really fixing it. It's just putting a bandage on a big wound.
You know what though? I think, and this is going to be a good segue. I found my segue here. I think music is the most healing thing for the soul. Good music. Every stage of my life, when I was going through a really hard time or something was really bad, I can remember the song that I listened. I'm almost getting teary now too. I can remember the songs that I listened to over and over again, like hundreds of times. The rhythm of those songs would put me into the flow state of finding the solution to my problems. And
you know what, brother? And it's beautiful. It's beautiful that you can weep because I think that's a natural thing for anybody to do. When I was on a forcible confinement weapons charges thing, I was a juror, and we were all fighting, and it was crazy. It's like 12 angry men, and the judge. I lost it at one point because it was just getting terrible. And I'm out in the hall, and she came up to me, and I thought she was gonna you got to compose yourself. You got to get back in there, and da 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 da.
Yeah.
And she didn't say that at all. She hugged me and she said, and she looked at me like she was my mom or something, and said, "I'm so happy that you can cry in front of them, and it shows that you're humanity, which is what they need right now, because they're all bickering and arguing and calling each other racists, and it's just awful.
Yeah,
right?
It's awful.
And healing and the release of that stuff is a part of healing." Even a part of elation that people have a hard time understanding. I've been given something in the past by a close friend or a family member, and I lose it. And they're like, "Why are you crying?" It's the thought and the intention behind that process that makes it so intense for me.
Sure.
It's not just it's the gift. It's not the gift. It's that action. It's the very same thing, like you say, making those decisions in that spiritualist-like way that are about the right decisions, even though some of those decisions may be extremely hard to make for you. They are the right decisions. Many of our archetypes, as you pointed out in the past, made those right decisions. You talk about Jesus Christ in that regard, the Nazarene, what did they do to him because of his ideas and opinions? Whether it be, I mean, he was a rebel, tipping over the tables of the temple, and speaking out against the Pharisees.
Let me ask you this. Think about this for a second, though. Think about this. Now, let's imagine for a second if what Jesus' mindset, if what is written about him is true, and I'm going to say that from let's say a literary perspective. So let's say we look at it from a literary perspective, and what is written about him is true, and what he says, like, I am the Son of Man. I am he who has come to fulfill the prophecy. Okay? So if a guy came along to you, now you think he was a cult leader, right? You think he was some kind of whack job, right? If a guy came around talking like Jesus, right? You think he was nuts, right? But the question is, like, if his life played out the way it did, and he said the most beautiful things, like his stories are the most beautiful stories we have in our heritage as humans. His parables are so deep, it's unbelievable. The prodigal son, the parable of the talents, there's just, I'm not going to start naming them off, but there's
Mustard
so much,
seed,
there's so much wisdom and depth in them that people preserved his stories. And if it's true that he was crucified and he believed that he had to be crucified, and all this was to fulfill a prophecy, does it matter metaphysically whether he was actually the Son of God or not? Or is the story inspirational enough on its own?
Wow. You know what? Two things stick out right away. It's a great question. I used to know, he's not with us anymore, bishop from the diocese for the Slovak diocese here in Canada. This is through my uncle. And I remember having pretty heavy philosophical conversations about theology and stuff like that. Not only with my uncle, but him and other priests and other people that would come to the house. Because my uncle, as I said, was a very devout person. And I remember once this guy said to me, you realize that he was like a rebel. We were getting into this whole thing. And I can't remember if I'd seen Jesus Christ Superstar or something like that. That was really like kind of...
Sure.
And he said, if the Christ were here today, he would refuse to participate in any of this. Even the very establishment that is relevating around who he is in terms of his divinity. Because it actually ties into what you said before. What was that experience for him? What was he doing? If the Gospels themselves are true to form in terms of the things that he did, whether
just assume they were. Don't worry about the miracles.
Assume that they were.
Don't worry about the miracles. Just
right.
Assume that he believed what he said he believed about himself. That's all you need to do.
And why did he do that? This is one of the things about his timely demise that is very interesting about being brought up in front of Pilate, which is, here he is amongst all these other criminals. And, Barabbas, and there's a whole connection to that whole decision-making process. And when Pilate asks him, are you, Jesus the Nazarene, this one that they're calling the Savior? And he says, supposedly, according to the text, I am that who you say I am.
Mm-hmm.
So did he pronounce that he was the Son of God? Did other people pronounce that he was that? And he took it upon himself to live in some state of divinity? Was he so morally sophisticated past the point of many people at that point in time to be able to discern the true right from wrong, like any archetype, heralded for it, and interestingly enough, eventually killed for it? I find it interesting that in the early Christian Empire, in terms of Constantine and the development of the Holy Roman Empire, that this integration between paganism and early pagan cultures, whether they be Germanic or they be Mediterranean, were all very tied into this sort of fiscal time frame of the year in terms of what Christianity was and the birth of Christ.
If you go to the Vatican, you go ahead. You go ahead.
No, but this is where things in the information are askew. I believe Christ to be a Libra. Okay, so that means that he had to have been born in September. So the time frame of this whole thing fiscally tied into paganized sort of in our Western version of what Christmas is and all of that, to me is askew. The important thing to recognize, I think, inside of Christianity, why I love that part of it, is because it is true faith in the moment, in the existence of what we were talking before. It's pronouncing and standing by the very validation of what you truly believe, to the point that they're willing to like make an example out of you.
Yes.
And did he know the consequences of what those actions would probably be? I think yes. This is what maybe in essence creates a sense of divinity in that sacrificial sheep that we look towards, because inevitability would have it, they knew. He probably knew. If I start saying, I'm sure there are people in this society today walking around that could articulate some unbelievably beautiful things and take actions in certain ways, but what would they be heralded as? Crazy, insane, nuts, whatever it might be. Just like you posed the question to me, what if this person just came out of the woodwork and started telling you he was divine? Or is divinity realized and recognized because of action? It's because of doings, those things that we bring out into the light, or we speak out against, or the stances that we take against those kinds of things.
Our opposition to a tyranny. Our opposition to tyranny.
What they would say in the past, that somebody would kill a few people, they call you a murderer. Kill hundreds of thousands of people, they call you a conqueror. Does it have some same sense of capacity and weight? Or becoming the sacrificial lamb because of those decision-making processes? I would even argue that we live today in a day and age where there's a similar fashion in the music culture that I live in and that we love. I have people that I consider archetypes in my life. Lennon or Bob Marley. Some of the things that Bob Marley wrote and talked about are actually being sung in churches today.
Sure.
Because of the spiritual message behind. Now, what is the family doing? All fighting behind the scenes, monopolizing who he is as a person, creating effigies and things to sell to people. It almost becomes sort of weird, some weird super subculture religion based around Marley. He would have hated that.
Oh, for sure.
As exact result of what it represents. What does Rolling Stone do? They even capitalize off of him and his effigy. Every 10 years, you're going to get Marley on the front cover of Rolling Stone. Let's bring this up again. Let's talk about what he was. Those ideals aren't what are being participated in. It's the very ego of who he was, or what that is, that they're trying to represent is what's important, and it's not. It's the same thing with the bishop from the diocese telling me the same thing. If Christ was here today, he wouldn't participate in any of this. It almost becomes that part of the mission of selflessness to say, you're by example, I'm doing this, and as a result, that's what creates his divinity. People started asking him all these questions about what he thought about. So I'm sure people today, even in our culture, are godlike, have a sense of divinity to who they are.
Oh, I meet them. I can meet them. Luke Sellers. Luke Sellers, he's a messenger from God, man. There's some divinity in that guy. I don't know what it is. I don't know how to call it, but there are people that you can meet that you just feel the presence of something on them, and it's a spiritual thing. And if people refuse to acknowledge that this exists, they're missing half of life.
That's right. And you know what? Maybe that we all, Michael, have that potential. Michael the Archangel. We all have that potential in us. And this is what you were saying before, is free will. Where do we decide to and how do we decide? And do we even get a chance to decide as a result of our experiences what this process is? And we cannot help but become those things. They become a necessary part of who we are in our development, spiritual development, hopefully. I, in some cases, feel there's been a real lack in spiritual development. And again, more triumph of the ego through materialism than there is heralding stuff about that we're talking about. That's alarming to me. I always thought that evolution in some ways meant that we were growing multifaceted aspects of who we were, and maybe over long periods of time and maybe over short periods of time. But some of the things that go on in this world today are pretty alarming.
I sense that there's, but you know what? I sense that, it's one of those things like, you ever heard of like we talked about Copernicus earlier, right? And you think like how counterintuitive it is for humans to think that they're not the center of the universe. Like actually takes some spiritual geometry to do that for yourself, right? So you're
Fear
like,
too, right?
yeah, it's like, I think therefore I am, the cogito. I think that's kind of cowardly of Voltaire to say that. I think you have to act therefore you are. You understand what I mean? You act.
Yeah.
You have to get out into the world and you have to experience it from your perspective, and you have to realize that it's only your perspective you have. That's it. You don't know what's actually going on, and everything else that you're engaging in, all these interactions. You know what's funny is if you look at humans and you look at, like if you watch like a school of fish swimming in the ocean, right? And you see the way they swim like that. And then you watch traffic on the 401. It looks really similar in a way, right? It's like we have free will, but we're moving within these patterns, and there's forces and patterns around us that may absolutely be beyond our control in a sense. But within that, we have to act out our little role within it. So I think it's dualistic. There's a polarity there again, that we actually have free will and we actually have no free will simultaneously. And that exists at the same time. And the struggle between those two things is like the struggle between good and evil.
Well, they're colliding. They're continually colliding, I think. Because some would argue, well, if we didn't have all of this structural definition in terms of everything that we're talking about, we would have collapse, we would have chaos, we would have all of this. But the reality of it is that sometimes, and a lot of times, human decompression and a detachment from what that machine of everything is a very healthy thing, because our thoughts aren't based on what that is. It's just based in the living, existing moment, which in some cases, living out in the middle of a jungle can be chaotic. You could become a part of the food chain, right? That's where I think that they're colliding on that level, just like the dark and the light of things. But so often, so a couple people said to me, like, so what was New York like? It's like, well, I love New York. It's a great place. There's amazing people there. The food and music culture is just amazing. But how I see, I was just 2 blocks off of Broadway, right? And in the heart of it, everything that is right and everything that is wrong is all focused in one spot. And because you go, wow, isn't that amazing? What great artistry. And I can't believe they're doing that. And da-da-da-da-da. And then all of a sudden, 6-story billboard with lights, with tons of ads about how you should look and dress and behave and all this other stuff. It's like this duality even exists there inside of that balance. And I think, is it necessary is the question I need to ask myself on a regular basis, or can it function on a positive polarity? Even in a battery, you have to have a negative and positive polarity in order to create that sense of charge that's going to whatever you're making work. That is that the conduit for change and growth. As I mentioned before, you can't, like we've said before, you can't have dark without light, can't have light without the dark. Is that what makes the light stronger? Is the dark? Is the dark which makes the light stronger in that, or the light making the dark stronger? And as a result, does it feed back in itself like a loop that keeps growing and growing, almost like cells dividing on itself until it becomes this new entity? What I do understand most about my perception of it, a lot of innocent souls are caught in the crossfire of it. And it really hurts me inside to see children, innocent women, men, all losing their lives and potentiality as a result of what that competence that you were talking about. Malevolence can be replaced with competence.
Yes,
to me, incompetence, that sense of what you were mentioning. It's not competent for a military, for me in my mind, to go in an area to occupy it because of taking a stance against another force start firing at one another with innocent people in the middle that have nothing to do with it. And as a result, hundreds of people have lost their lives as a result of that decision-making process.
Millions.
For the better.
Millions and millions.
Oh, I know it. And I'm just, I'm only using it in a factional thing. But we know for hundreds of years, millions of people have lost their lives as a result of this, not just soldiers in the military that have been fighting.
Sure.
So that's what really makes me question that where ego overrides into that. Because if ego overrides the decision-making process, whether somebody lives or not, and they're innocent, that's malevolent. That's maniacal.
The opposite of the ultimate expression of America's malevolent egotism is the drone strikes. I can't get over that idea of, I don't know if it's Arlington or Arizona or whatever. There's some bunker in Arizona that some kid's playing a video game. He's flying above people and he's sending hellfire down upon them. To me, that is so cowardice and malevolent. It's beyond belief. There's nothing honorable about that. There's no sense of duty being expressed there. There's no higher purpose. There's no light of Christ or empirical light. There's no redeeming idea behind it. It's just cowardice on a digital scale.
Yeah, you could vaporize somebody from a helicopter at 20,000 yards out. Don't have to be there to have their last breath splashed in your face, right?
There's no honor in that fighting.
No, and I think that's what, in the weirdest of ways, whether it's intentional.
And this is hang on a second, in case there's U.S. people listening to this. I'm not trying to disparage any soldiers or any courageous veterans or anything like that. I really have a great appreciation.
I work with the Veterans Associations in the United States.
I have a great appreciation of those who serve their countries in war, and I'm not an anti-war guy and everything else, but there's something about those drone strikes that just strike me as so antithetical to courage and so opposite of everything we supposedly stand for.
And with the same thing with the veterans that I do know in the United States who served their time, and the work that I have done makes me realize that they, in many ways, feel like they were taken advantage of. I don't think anybody that had a sense of patriotism for their own country, that felt truly under some sense of threat, would have a problem protecting their homeland, their family, their friends, whatever it might be. But through their own experiences and self-admittal in their own situations, came to the realization that they were, in some cases, there as part of corporate security.
Yeah.
And that it wasn't about fighting a battle for some maniacal something. It was we're high-end security guards with rifles protecting oil fields and other things that are like that. So I know for a fact that Americans who had served time, and I'm talking multiple tours of duty, or even running their own radio shows talking about these kinds of circumstances, felt very taken advantage of. So I have no disrespect for the people that have had to put themselves in harm's way. Some of them are my close friends, but that still doesn't mean that it gives me the non-ability to discuss what I think is right or wrong about the advent of what that is. I've seen it, not directly in front of me, but I've witnessed enough of it through what I've viewed that I can't get out of my head, of seeing arms shot off, legs, kids with their faces missing, vets that I know now that are back because of the things that they did when they were on their tours of duty that are now bedridden, don't get any assistance from the federal government as a result of the things that they did, clandestine project. Like, that is what I'm getting at, where people are continually being taken advantage of. And that's where I hope somebody that's competent enough, because we're saying competence can replace the malevolence. Yeah. That I hope that's a reality. I think.
Yeah, what's interesting about that? I was telling my kids a story about the First World War, and I like war history. And I was telling them a story. My daughter came back, and she was learning about victory bonds and the war. And I said, well, here's how it worked. When the First World War started out, Britain put up an embargo to prevent America from trading with Germany. America would have gladly sold supplies to Germany. In the First World War, there was no moral reason they were against them. And in fact, there's more German people in America than British people. And Britain was, America's hated enemy, the American Revolution and all that stuff. So I said, but they were happy to sell the equipment to Britain. And so Britain was paying them with gold, like straight up gold at Fort Knox or wherever it was. And America was sending over guns and bombs and bullets and all this sort of stuff through I think it was the Lend-Lease Act through Canada and over to Britain and blah, 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 to remain neutral. And they didn't want to enter the war. And then I said, about halfway through the war, Britain started to run out of gold. So they handed America paper and they said, the Americans said, what the hell is this, motherfucker? You know what I mean? What are you talking about, paper? Where's the gold? And Britain said, well, this is called a victory bond. And if we win, we're going to pay. But if we lose, we're not going to pay. Right?
Right.
And then my son turns to me and he says, so the only reason the America entered the First World War is so they could get their money back?
From the mouths of babes.
Yeah. And I'm like, actually, yes, that's the reason. And then they made up all this propaganda about the Kaiser. Because and people think like the Nazis, like a lot of kids will think that the Germans in the First World War were the same as the Germans in the Second World War. Completely different situation. The First World War was just a bunch of egotistical maniacs killing each other like crazy. It had nothing to do with they all were bad. They're all stupid.
Because they could.
Yeah, because they could just, send men into a meat grinder, right? And I still think, you know what? I still think we're recovering psychologically from that war. I still think I think like Canada and Germany and France and we're still. But anyway, it's like it's so obvious that the only reason they went to war was to get their money back, but yet there's like this feeling that no, the Kaiser, the evil Germans, and we're kind of getting further and further away from the Second World War now, and we're kind of looking at it in history, and people are going, you know what? That's not really what happened in the First World War. What really happened in the First World War is America wanted to get its money back. So they sent, whatever 100,000 Americans to die to get their money back. But in order to trick them into going over there so that they could get their money back, they had to turn the Kaiser into this evil, nasty guy, make a Manichaean, set up a Manichaean thought process, good versus evil. We need to make up all these reports. And then all of a sudden, you read the same thing about Saddam Hussein, and you start seeing this like, hang on a second here. So, the Kuwaitis were stealing oil. So I think it was Shell that invented that diagonal horizontal drilling in Kuwait. I think it was Shell. And I think they did it in Kuwait. They invented it in Kuwait. And what they did was they drilled down and then they drilled over into Iraq and started stealing the oil from Iraq.
Yeah, slant drilling.
Yeah, I think they invented it in Kuwait. And then Saddam Hussein discovers this. He catches them doing it, right? And so he takes his 500,000 troops and invades Kuwait. Well, you know what? If it turned out that Pemex, the Mexican oil company, was horizontally drilling into Texas and had been stealing oil by the billions for years, you don't think America might say, you're fucking dead, Mexico. Like you pay us back right now. Right? And so the idea that Saddam Hussein was this evil guy and he was killing babies in Kuwait and it was all for no reason at all. He's just a madman. He's a real psychopath. He's just a crazy maniac. And the only reason he's invading Kuwait is because he's got weapons of mass destruction and he wants to take out Israel and he's anti-Israel and he's anti-democracy and he's evil personified. And now we have to send in the U.S. government to take him out and move him out and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, hang on a second here. Couldn't you just sit down with these two parties and say, hey, look, buddy, you stole the oil. You have to pay him back. Or, isn't there another, am I that naive to think that there's another way?
During all that. During all that, right? Why did we have a United Nations so we could perpetuate the idea that this could,
were some Americans or some high-level billionaire Americans on the take with these Kuwaiti guys? And they wanted to keep that a secret. I mean, I don't know, man.
Well, that's the thing. And what is alarming about all of this that we could look at is that we don't know. And Jim Mars once said, good acts are done in the light, in the light, right? Bad, dark acts are done in the dark, hidden,
Sure.
right? Kept. There are so many things in historical change that usually lead to some sort of revolutionary, warlike mechanism that it's pretty hard not to think that there's something in it. You know, like you said, making money. One of the very things that I go to right away is like, you Google it now, go on YouTube, you can watch Americans in 1941 walking in the streets with Nazi flags and American flags, because the fascist movement was actually quite embraced by a lot of people.
I don't know about 41, but maybe 37, 38, 39, yeah.
Well, even maybe as far as the early 40s.
You think so?
Proponents of fascism like Margaret Sanger, who was an American herself, who was even quoted in Mein Kampf, was still very for this idea behind even racial purity and what this represented. Ironically, that in 42, there were so many Americans that weren't involved in getting involved in the war because of those things that you said. We're still recuperating from what happened in the First World War. Mm-hmm. That until Pearl Harbor, that the Americans were actually attacked, it justified the American conscience in order to say, yes, now we're a part of this. We are going to be a part of this. And I would even argue that in terms of certain things like conquestual land takeovers or resource takeovers, one of the things that we know the Middle East is extremely rich in and has been for years is oil. But, you know, there's been a lot of conflict at the United States, whether it be Afghanistan and stuff that was going on in earlier part of the years, fighting the Russians as a result of that and communism. There was still a lot of things that they knew that the area was rich in. And along comes all of a sudden this event like 9/11. And really, when you're thinking about who was responsible for it, was supposed to be bin Laden. They went after Hussein. And a couple of the reasons why is
I didn't get that. Why? What the hell's that about?
This is the thing. And not only that, to point out a couple of things. One of the biggest resources and richest resources in the world, other than oil in the world in the Middle East, is in fact lithium. The biggest veins of lithium and mines, the potential for money and gold, copper, are all in those regions of the world. So you now then have the ability on a military level to go in to fight that area, take it over, and in essence occupy it, so that even puppet regimes through political stuff or creating Ahmadinejad, the whole thing that went on with him and his stance, it rings very true to your concept about Saddam Hussein moving people in. The guy's the leader of his country. He's got the superpower of the free world supposedly breathing down his neck. What kind of stance would you take for your country and people? Passive? I wouldn't. As a result, I would probably be heralded as a maniacal leader. And anything could be made up and said about me as a result of that. But that doesn't mean that doesn't necessarily not happen. We could look at the Korean environment as a result of what goes on in subjugation of people and slavery and other things in a very similar fashion. But I guess, in essence, when those kinds of things, that the proverbial Mary Shelley's Frankenstein can be created, the monster is here. We've created it. Now we need to destroy it. That seems to be the recycling method through a lot of different factions of who we are as people over the last couple hundred years, in terms of whether it be global sort of branching out in the military, whether it be obtaining lands or resources, as I mentioned before. But again, it's not usually based out of the idea that, people, need a place to live. They need to be happy, clean, safe, and well fed. We want that resource. We need it now. It ties back into what you were mentioning a long time ago in the conversation about, well, why do people do that? Is it because of this? Is it because of ego? Is it over a period of time there isn't people fighting for what they believe, and it's easy to take it over, and that's why malevolent behavior starts to exist. There's so many facets into what that represents on a sociological level that it's almost even hard to navigate. This is where a bigger part of the picture from that other thing that we were talking about, which is this conspiratorial? Is this something that we're making up? Is we anthropomorphizing this? Can we just connect any kind of
Is
dot and create any
incompetence
kind of,
isn't incompetence enough? Is incompetence
right,
enough?
right,
You know,
right.
whatever. Yeah.
It is that some of the statements that I've heard from some people about what this is that whatever is being woven, whether it be intentional or unintentional, is so intense that nobody can escape it. And I think order through chaos, and I even hate using that statement, but chaos has its own way of developing and flourishing without you having to do anything.
I think both of them are I think both chaos and order have like a surge and a burnout effect. I'm not sure that, you know, we are like, this is where that idea between free will and not free will kind of clash again. It's like,
right,
there are times of chaos. There are times of war. There are times of peace, right? Vanity of vanities. All is vanity, right? You know, we are in for whatever reason right now, we are in a time of acrimony and war and faction finding and division and deep in a sense of lack of purpose, a sense of lostness, a lack of faith in the human mission, a sense that we are lacking our own divinity, the deep and dark struggles that are brought about by corporate opioid addictions. Like, that's really dark and insidious, that place, that opioid thing in the United States. Like, that's a really dark, dirty corner of America that, like, really, there's something really dark there, that some evil to do that to other humans, your fellow citizens, is so dark. It's evil. Like, that what they did was evil with those opioids. And then you have you have this idea now that's popular in our society that people are gender fluid, and maybe this is going to cause controversy, but like the idea that you can, I'm not saying, there are some people that have real gender dysphoria, and I'm not here to tell them. There's people that are trans. I'm not here to judge on anybody. But this idea that people can switch genders in real time, and that right now I'm a he and later I'm a she, and now you have to address me with this pronoun, and this idea that people's genders can be fluid and other people accept this is a deep, dark, egotistical validation that is very concerning to me. It's like you're not, like, everything we have is based on whether you're a man or a woman, and whether you're married or whatever, and that is a complete chaos. That is total chaos embodied in a human being. And maybe it's controversial to say this, but there's something about it which strikes me as a force, like a zeitgeist of our society, of the incremental progress of chaos towards a place where nobody is anything anymore. You know what I'm saying? You're not a man, you're not a woman, you're not a Canadian, you're nothing. You're just a product of evolution. Actually, the world might be better off if you were dead and you didn't exist, because all you do is pollute and cause carbon emissions and you're worthless. It's a dark time, man. We're in dark times now, and there's something, I think everybody knows it and feels it. And I think when you read Steven Pinker's book about, how optimistic everything, let me show you all these paper statistics. I don't know, man.
But I have a hard time living in that false sense of security based on what that is. But
I got the paper to prove it, Ed.
Yeah, but it's not enough.
But I got the paper.
You know what? If I go to a doctor's office and I see that they've got on their wall their medical diploma, mm-hmm. It's not enough for me to know that they're just a doctor with a diploma. I don't even know if they're a good doctor.
But I got the paper. I got the paper.
But that doesn't. None of that is. See, that's where I have a hard time discerning from what that is, because none of.
But I
that's
wrote it
right.
on paper. But I read it on paper.
Right. Here's the stats. We've got it to prove it, right?
Yeah,
But
it's on paper.
It's not enough in the physical realm of thinking about stuff in terms of your reaction with it that makes it real in any way, shape, or form. I've seen so many mixed opinions about what global warming is that
It's the end of days.
for myself, but my point is that, like, people in a conversation want the dialectic. Are you or aren't you? Are you red or you blue? Are you black or you white?
Yeah,
What, right? So it's not enough for me. Usually my conversations around a lot of things where people have already formulated an opinion, which in some cases could be formulated on ill-advised information.
Sure.
It usually leads me to, oh, you're a fence sitter. No, I'm not a fence sitter. I don't have all the information in front of me to make a conscious decision for myself, not based on the meme or anything else that's there, to say this is why I think this. Why I would be affected in the moment of the information is because I'm emotionally being affected by it. That would probably, in some cases, for some people, create a moment to jump directly because of that emotional moment to make an ill-formed opinion. So that's what I don't want in my decision-making process. So don't call me a fence sitter. I just don't have enough information on what that is to be able to critically say I'm willing to make this consequential change to who I am in order to sublimate the moment.
Yeah,
just to make you feel better or group think feel better. This is one of the most dangerous things about societal change, is it's so based in group think that people aren't acting on the premise of, like, well, what is the telemetry? Can I get some more information on what this is? Well, no, this is what it is. This is what so and so said on the CBC. It must be true, right?
It's funny.
How do you know that?
It's funny because there was a chicken in the field, and let's call him Chicken Little here, Ed. Right? And the sky's been falling since Chicken Little, and guess what Chicken Little does? He runs and gets Turkey Lurkey, Goosey Lucy, and Ducky Lucky, and he tells them all about how the sky is falling. And you know what? Foxy Loxy, he comes along, and he just says, "Oh, the sky is falling." Well, you know what? It's real safe in my lair. Why don't you come into my lair? Right? So whenever I'm told the sky is falling, I always ask myself, who are you? Are you Chicken Little, Turkey Lurkey, or Foxy Loxy?
Right.
Which one in the story are you?
Yeah, beautifully said, because that goes into what I was saying about the danger of being so caught in the sky's the falling society that when Foxy Loxy shows up with the den to protect everybody, who is that? Is he the savior, or is he the wolf in sheep's clothing?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to be that there have been moments in time where that has been the solution for a nation. You and I are fascinated by what happened during the Second World War.
Adolf Hitler is Foxy Loxy for sure, right, man. He brought that country into a hell there.
But what's interesting to note about that, and that even for the fact of the matter is that, here the Germans are fighting the British again. And the Queen of England is really of German descent.
Yeah, she's a German, for sure.
So they're fighting their own countrymen. One of the things about Prince Edward abdicating his position on the throne, other than his supposed marriage to a wealthy divorcee, which was a no-no, and that's why he, stepped down, couldn't be king, was because of that. But he was one of the biggest Nazi sympathizers in Europe at that time, and in fact believed in a lot of Hitler's missions. In fact, was a fascist himself. Closet, though, but still he's of that blanket or sheep wolf factor.
So
for me
so
in that
so let me
regard.
ask you this. Do you think that, let me ask you this, along this line,
Excuse me.
I think so. You got Chicken Little, right? Which is the fool that leads everyone to destruction, with based on very little evidence. Okay. Then
Right.
you got the followers, Turkey Lurkey, Ducky Lucky, and Goosey Lucy, and then you got the predator, Foxy Loxy, right? And it's a funny children's story, but it's actually quite dark because we see it happen all the time.
Right.
And the results can be deadly to humans. But is the CBC Ducky Lucky or Chicken Little or Foxy Loxy? Like, what role is the CBC playing in all this? You know, like, who's the Chicken Little of the global warming thing, and who's the Foxy Loxy? Like, or are all of them being 100% straightforward and honest with us, and we are entering the end of days? Which one is it? You know what I mean? I can't, like, that's like it,
That's
because if it's true, we're
what's
entering the end of days, and Dr. Joy Pugh is right, and John the Revelator told us all about it from Patmos 2,000 years ago, right? Like, there's only two choices there. Either we're being lied to and we're being manipulated and something's happening, but it's not this death nail in the coffin. All the ice sheets are going to melt and we're all going to burn up alive. Maybe, it's either that's true and we're in the end of days because there's nothing we can do to stop it, okay? Or there's a Foxy Loxy out there somewhere just waiting for stupid Chicken Little to bring his friends into his lair.
Well, you know what? This is just a huge question. It's hard to hold. I think about it often. And one of the things about the analogy that we're using with the animals is, I know from being a farmer, they all exist on a farm. So who's running the farm and who owns the farm? I think that they're like, inside of what this all represents, many people operating with wonderful intent and truth and want to. I think in some cases there are things
That's
now
Ducky
that are,
Lucky. That's Ducky Lucky.
that's Ducky Lucky. I think Chicken Littles are those that are continually screaming about everything that makes us different from one another. Those are the ones that are always pointing out that this is the bad person, they're doing this wrong. Look at this crisis. I mean, it's everywhere. That part of what makes this product better than this product, and why you'll feel better, because it's everywhere. And whether it intentionally or not, or there's an agenda based on it, and I know that working in media, there are certain things you can't talk about, especially on certain kinds of shows and certain kind of broadcasting levels. So we don't discuss these kinds of topics, nor will they be discussed, because it will be bleeped out for whatever reason. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of this network. How many times have you heard something like that?
Sure.
So they're going to make money through their advertising with a show on their network that they don't necessarily agree with. Are they posing that just to be the opposite end of the spectrum, or do they more care about making money? I think that the Chicken Littles are more concerned about with making money and an agenda they don't really understand behind them. And the Foxy Loxies, as you put it, are yet to really be truly determined, because there's a lot of fingers that we could point and a lot of paths we could go down. And ironically, I'm often reminded of the Wizard of Oz in these kinds of conversations, where when you follow the money trail, or where, and I'm not talking to you about $1 billion. That's nothing in the grand scheme of things. It's more or less who holds the reins to what all those factions are connected to. And usually there's some analogy or not analogy or a line of thinking which leads you there, or eventually with enough good investigative journalistic work can pretty much determine that this is probably what's going on. You can't factually lay it out, but you can pretty much determine through that investigation, just like a police officer would, that this would be the likelihood of the suspect. You can't get a warrant yet because you're only working on circumstantial evidence.
Sure.
But it's enough there to run an investigation. So who those people are, we could look back at the last 300 or 400 years of history, or even some may arguably say thousands of years of history, in order to determine who those people are. Or are they even people?
We know them.
Is it more of a...
I think it has a spiritual element too. I think there's principalities and powers at work in the world, and it's. I'm glad to meet you, Ed.
You too, Michael. It's really been great talking with you. Man.
Yeah, but it's been 3 hours, if you can believe it.
I can believe it. I looked at the clock earlier. My wife had gone out to have her hair done, and she was going at 12:15, and I knew we were meeting at 1, and I went, it's 4.
Yeah.
So here's the deal. You're in Toronto. You're not that far from me. We should just meet up and have a great cup of coffee one day.
Yeah, for sure. After the show, tell the listeners out there where they can find your music that we're supposed to talk about, but over 3 hours, we didn't even get to it. We'll have to do it again.
Next time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So tell them where they can find your music.
That's edroman.net. You can get a hold of me there. All my social networking buttons, plus links to where the record is being sold. It's online. It's available everywhere from Amazon to iTunes, CD Baby. All of my music is available online. You can listen to older stuff on SoundCloud. Anytime you want to search for me, look for Special Ed Roman, whether that's Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. It doesn't matter what it is. That's kind of where my existence is. Special Ed. Education, dyslexic, that's where that kind of sticks in there.
Thanks,
and it's been great being on the show, man. I love talking with you.
Yeah,
my mind is like, woohoo!
Well, you know what the thing is? The whole reason I started this thing was so that I could have these kinds of conversations. When do you get to sit down with someone for 3 hours and just talk? So rare these days, No,
that's true. And you made my day, man. It's been a wonderful show. I really appreciate it.
Quid pro quo. If you are interested in starting a podcast, your own podcast, go to getagripstudios.com. We are the best deal in the GTA for podcasting. I think so anyway. I have the best studio, I think. So go to getagripstudios.com. Also, you can come in like Ed just did over our virtual studio. You can have update guests in the virtual studio. Just give us an email or call us and ask for Scott, and he'll get you set up. For right now, I'm super grateful for you if you've listened to this. If you've listened to 3 hours of me and Ed talk. You know what, though? I think you might, because I thought it was super interesting, and I learned a ton of stuff from Ed Roman. Check out his music. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, no problem. Talk to you, Ed.
Talk to you too, guys. Pleasure.